The video that was playing on my phone had Dominic Toretto saying, "Family." The guy watching him listened with a smile as Dominic Toretto said that he was facing a duel not for life, but for death. Looking at this video and the views on it, the guy rejoiced that he finally made a viral video. And now he can get some advertising money. The guy was so engrossed in his phone that when he was crossing the road, he didn't even notice the truck speeding towards him. The next moment, the guy found himself standing in front of the girl behind the counter, in some obscure place that was completely white, except for what he saw in front of him. At his question about whether he was dead, the girl gave him a disgruntled look and wondered why he needed to get there when she was about to finish her workday. Out loud, she said that since his videos had brought joy to many, would he want to be reborn? Toth immediately asked if he had a choice. Hearing back that he had no choice and needed to hit the random button on the lottery machine, the guy immediately did so. The one immediately started spinning around and eventually stopped on an inscription that stated that the guy would return to the past #1 expert in the world of martial arts, the Demon Lord of Chi-Wei. Without looking at the how, the guy cheered. The girl pointed to a door in the distance and told him as he calmed down to quickly walk through that door. Without wasting any time, the guy immediately jumped out the door he had been told about, and with an exclamation that the #1 expert in the world of martial arts had arrived, slammed the door behind him. In her turn, the girl who was about to leave stopped and decided to see what was actually written there. Pulling out a piece of paper, she read what was actually written there, and said that they had already said that this system needed to be updated urgently. The text was longer and not fully visible. In fact, it said that one would fall into the past of waiter Ah Wei, who was accidentally killed by the #1 expert in the world of martial arts, Demon Lord Chi-Wei. He didn't even realize it himself. He opened his eyes and looked at the sky in front of his eyes, and ignoring the rain, tried to figure out where he was. The next instant, he quickly jumped up and happily thought that this was just amazing. He had traveled through time after all. And now, his luck had turned to him because he had traveled back in time to the dark expert, #1 in the world of martial arts, Demon Lord Chi-Wei. Even so, it was still somehow strange to him that the body looked so shabby. Suddenly, his gaze fell on some object lying at his feet. What it was he didn't know, but thought it clearly had some significance. Before the boy could even think about it, men with swords descended into the clearing behind him. Those people immediately began to look around, and the one who stepped forward said that it was even strange, because before that, Chi-Wei's aura had been there, but now it was gone. At the guy's question as to whether they were looking at him, everyone immediately turned in his direction and began to frown. Noticing the demon's sex sign in his hands, one of them shouted it out loud and said that it was definitely him. And then they shouted in shock that it was a demon lord, and he had even changed his appearance. Looking at him, all three of them discussed that this was indeed that bloodthirsty aura. Someone told the guy that he's cruel and has hurt so many people with his technology. He's also infected with the poison of 1,000 insects, and his power is no longer comparable to what it used to be. The guy immediately thought fearfully that since he was shrouded in poison, no wonder he had to disguise himself as a commoner, and now it made sense. The next moment, the three men drew their swords and pointed them at the gloomy boy, saying that today they would cut off his head. To their bewilderment, the guy only hummed derisively and asked with a smile if they were really capable of that. Then he laughed out loud like a madman, thinking that even though he had been poisoned, he was still the best martial artist in the world of martial arts. While they were there talking, lightning struck over the men's heads, and the light rain turned into a real downpour. One of the men immediately thought that at this rate, they could only use one move to get rid of the guy. Therefore, they immediately crossed their swords and activated the Holy Golden Sword Formation technique. A pillar of golden light immediately struck upwards towards the sky, and the guy meanwhile asked if he really thought this little trick could hurt him. The next lightning that was striking the tree felt the conductivity of the golden pillar and immediately headed in its direction, after which she immediately struck it, and the pillar itself conducted energy into the swords the men were holding. The guy in turn covered his eyes and adopted a haughty pose, thinking that although he still didn't know how to use this technique, but he was now Xiao Shui, and he just needed to rely on the instincts of this body. He was so busy thinking about it that he didn't notice anything around him. Not even the fact that three people had been electrocuted behind him. As if sensing something was wrong, the guy turned around and looked with interest at the place where they were. But to his surprise, he saw no one, and wondered aloud how in an instant these experts disappeared. And under his feet, meanwhile, lay charred bones, all that remained of the three men who had wanted to kill him. But the guy looking at his hand thought that here was the master's power, and it's really too amazing. After a while, he came to a village where he immediately noticed that it was too noisy, and he even wondered if this was a real combat world or not. Suddenly, some girl turned around and pointed her finger in the direction, asking her mother if it was that demon Lord Chiwei. The guy immediately froze fearfully, thinking she was talking about him and pointing a finger at him. As he walked past the crowd, all he could think about was whether or not he had been recognized, and how that was even possible. After all, the guy had definitely changed his appearance. But now he didn't know what to do, and whether to tell about it or not. Turning his head to the side, he noticed the wanted poster for the Demon Lord hanging on the bulletin board and the man's portrait on it. For a while he looked at it in silence and read the information written there. Afterward, he covered his eyes and exhaled, and thought that, thankfully, he had changed, not immediately paying attention to the child who had called him. But as soon as he realized he was addressing him, he immediately turned around incomprehensibly, listening to the question of what he was even doing there. After a while, the boy brought the guy to the guest rooms with the words that he didn't think he'd be so unlucky. After all, not only had he fallen off a cliff, but he had also lost his memory. He disappeared for 2 days, and everyone thought he had returned to his hometown. After showing him one of the rooms, the boy said that this was his room, and he needed to change first because the chief was very angry. Taking some notebooks and books from the table, the boy asked if this was his room, and then he smugly thought it was his fake personality. And the 36 personality strategy is a very good one. After that, he looked at the plate with a smile, thinking that he needed to familiarize himself with this person, and preferably to do it quickly. No miracle happened. And after a while, the guy stood in the kitchen holding a knife in one hand and a chicken in the other, and incomprehensibly tried to understand what was going on. The man in front of him menacingly asked what was the matter, and if he had hit his head so hard that he couldn't even butcher a chicken. The next moment, the guy thought he realized, and it was to hide the initial bloodthirsty aura on him. Watching the guy trying to butcher a chicken, the man kept scolding him and grumbling that he wasn't doing anything good and couldn't even do that. Noticing that the man wasn't answering anything, the man loudly asked if he was deaf. After all, he had been talking to him all along. At that moment, the guy slammed his knife loudly on the table, chopping off the chicken's head in one motion. The sound was so loud that the man himself immediately fell silent and jumped up startled. Meanwhile, the guy turned around, and with a frantic look on his face asked what the matter was, and if there was anything else he wanted to bring to his attention. A few hours ago, a true master massacred, and looking at how no one could resist him, laughed madly, calling those pathetic ants. One of those who confronted him told the others that reinforcements would be arriving soon, and tonight, they must stop the demon. The one in turn laughed loudly at them, looking red-eyed and activating the seal in his hand. The same girl shouted that this was bad, and he was going to pass the order to his subordinates, so they should stop him now. The man immediately pointed his hand towards the people heading towards him, and activated some sort of spell, immediately killing them. With all this, he asked if they really wanted to stop him, and how such lowlifes could even think of such a thing. Meanwhile, somewhere in the mountains, Ah Wei sat by the grave, and said that the Dabin whom he had slaughtered was poor, but the guest had nibbled even his bones. Then he exhaled, and sadly asked for a promise that he wouldn't become a chicken in his next life. While the guy was saying that after taking a breath of fresh air he should get back to work, a blob of magical energy flew towards him from the back, which immediately pierced through him, causing him to fly far backwards from the force of the blow. That's how the guy fell down the cliff below, unable to stand on his feet or get a grip on anything. Falling off the cliff, the guy's only thought was that it was windy today, and there was no need to hurry anyway. And Wei chopped the chicken and turned toward the man standing behind him with a smile, as if asking what he wanted to say to him. However, the one could only say the word "you," trying to figure out what had happened to this kid. And wasn't he the one acting timid a couple days ago? Looking at how the boy calmly wipes the blood from his chin, the man thought about the fact that he had been in the underworld for so many years, and this boy dares to behave like this in front of him. Looking at the guy, the man loudly told him not to play games with him because he could turn him into a dish himself. However, Ah Wei didn't listen to him, and instead thought about the fact that this guy might not be the strongest there, but his muscles are pretty good, so he's using him as a pile of muscles. The next moment, realizing he wasn't being listened to, the man kicked the table with force and grabbed the whole fish lying there. Then, with a loud question about why the hell he was looking at him like that, he swung the fish at the guy. He, in turn, easily dodged the blow, and with a grim expression he picked up the knife, asking to himself to let him test what the man was really worthy of. Looking at his behavior, the cook wasn't so sure of himself anymore. Without thinking long, he, still holding out the fish in the guy's direction, asked loudly what the guy was doing. Without realizing what had happened, the cook found himself knocked off his feet in one swift movement. And quickly approaching Ah Wei, he immediately inserted a bloody axe into the wall next to the neck of the man who was frightened by what was happening. After which, with a creepy smile and eyes burning red, he asked if the cook knew the recipe for his favorite dish. The guy answered this question himself too, telling me that he had to prepare the ingredients first. And after that, roll them in starch and then add spices, then crush and marinate them. After marinating the ingredients, we needed to lightly fry them in a pan with oil. And finally, at the very end, it should have added an exquisite presentation to the dish. After getting close to the man, the guy put a knife to his throat and in a creepy voice asked if he wanted to try it himself, because the main ingredient there is pork. The next moment, the man could no longer withstand the pressure on him and cried loudly in fear. Looking at him, the guy clucked, thinking that he hadn't even started yet, and he was already so cowardly. It would ruin the reputation of their dark sect if he brought such a henchman out. Aloud, he said it was no fun at all, and with an edge of his eye, he looked toward the door with interest. The workers gathered there looked at the unfolding scene with fear, so the guy felt obliged to ask if everything was normal and if something was wrong. Those answered nothing, referring to the fact that they had to continue their work, and this the guy preferred to leave without comment. After which, he turned around and asked with a tired sigh if it was full of such losers. And if it wasn't too much to ask, could he get someone obedient for a change? The next moment, he felt someone take hold of his clothes, and he immediately cast his eyes downward in incomprehension. There stood the very boy who had found him and brought him there, and with sparkling eyes looked at him silently. After a while, it was finally nightfall, and the workday was over in that area. When he came to his wooden house, the guy immediately tiredly fell on the bed, happy that he could finally lie quietly. With a loud yawn, the guy pronounced that he was finally done with work and was pretty tired after everything. He began to think to himself that learning martial arts and investigating the current state of the sect was difficult. But even so, the life of a master could never be easy. So he also remembered that child and decided he had found a promising talent in him. And when it comes to martial arts, you have to start at a young age. After all, only training from childhood is the only way to ensure their realization. Suddenly, his stomach rumbled, causing the guy to immediately get out of bed and look up in surprise, remembering that he hadn't eaten anything all day yet. So he immediately went outside and sweetly stretching happily said that it was time for him to make a night snack, and then he could talk to that child. Meanwhile, the man in the hotel threw the boy into the wall with force, not paying attention to his age at all. Then he approached him and rudely asked him if he had completely lost his memory. Looking at him with a scornful look, without waiting for an answer, the man said he thought his brain might have been seriously injured. Still not getting any answers, he moved closer and kicked the wall with force, pressing the boy even harder against it and asking if he wasn't close to that guy. Because it seems to him that an orphan and a loser make the perfect duo. And they even dared to provoke the chef, who happened to be Zhao's buddy. Let them just wait for Zhao to return, then they would see what fate had in store for them. The next moment, he changed his mind and asked himself aloud, why not take the opportunity to help the chief? And when Zhao returned, he would score some points. Reaching that conclusion, the man smiled evilly, thinking to himself that he was just too damn brilliant. Turning to the boy again, the man told him to find an opportunity to get this loser out for him. The next instant, they both turned at the rumble of the door being kicked in with one blow, the door not having expected this turn of events. And while the boy stared in surprise at the door that had fallen behind him, the man on the contrary looked at the figure in front of him. There, in the clouds of smoke and dust, the figure of the guy the man was looking for began to emerge. He was still in the same pose, holding the bun in his mouth. Ignoring the boy's admiring gaze, the boy said he'd had enough of talking, and taking a bite of the bun extended his finger towards the man with the words that the main character was now coming on stage. Looking at the man who came in, the man quickly pulled himself together and said with an arrogant smile that here was the culprit of the celebration. To himself, he smiled even wider, thinking that this was just the perfect chance to beat this guy up and please Master Zhao. And the guy in turn thought about the fact that this was a great chance to teach this man a lesson and show the young apprentice the power of a master. He was certain that the boy would begin to literally idolize him when he dealt with this idiot. Both were thinking about their own things, but in the end they both came to the same conclusion. This was just a great chance for their plans to come to fruition. Without thinking, the man removed his bangs in one motion and said that he had not been taught to respect his elders. If he knelt down and apologized now, he might consider pardoning him. Silent for half a word, the man notices that the boy is not paying any attention to him, and patting the boy on the head, tells him to step aside and wait for him for now. This really pissed him off, so he angrily asked if he had lost his self-preservation instinct along with his memory, and how dare he ignore it. At his words about not daring to act like he was better than him, the guy with a strange smile finally turned in his direction, continuing to smile even as he swung his fist in his direction with loud words about how a loser will always remain a loser. The boy easily dodged his hand, and the blow flew neatly past his face. Quickly turning around, Ah Wei grabbed the man's still outstretched hand, and in one swift motion, easily flipped him onto his back, causing him to hit the floor painfully. Even as he was falling, the man still couldn't understand how that had even happened, or why he was so easily pinned down. Already lying on the floor, the man stared fearfully at the guy in front of him, not understanding what he was going to do. However, the guy himself didn't do anything, and just silently stood up, not even turning towards the fallen man. Under his gaze, he happily said that it really worked. And the hours spent watching self-defense videos had not been in vain. He had wanted to test this technique in practice for a long time anyway, even though he can't use all the cool techniques of this body yet. But with his current energy, even ordinary kicks and throws become deadly. The whole time he was talking out loud to himself, the guy he dropped on the floor was watching him shocked. Instead of what the guy was actually saying, the man heard something completely different. That it was all annoying to the guy, and he was actually thinking about how to get rid of him, so he wouldn't reveal anything. And it didn't immediately get to him what he was talking about, what it meant to reveal his real identity. But after a moment, it finally got to him, which calmed the man down a bit. After all, he'd read about it in a book before, and this guy clearly wasn't who he said he was. The next moment, the guy turned to him and looked at him in surprise, trying to figure out if he had really recovered and recovered so quickly from his incredible throw. The man, on the other hand, thought fearfully about how he had never seen such movements before. Jumping up, the man asked loudly, trying to remain calm, who he even was. However, the guy answered nothing, and only silently approached him and took him by the throat, lifting him above the floor. Afterward, holding him overhanging, asked him what he had just yelled. Hearing no response, he told the man to answer how he even knew who he was. With all of this, the guy reflected. After all, although this man was a complete weakling, he was still able to sense his true strength, and on top of that was able to experience his throw filled with spiritual energy. That's why he let the man go, making him fall to his knees, and the man thought he was completely insane. Meanwhile, the guy said that since he had found out about everything, he had no choice but to do so, and held out his hand towards the man, and forcefully stabbed him in the back, not expecting, hoping that this time he would definitely get rid of him. The man's back was immediately shot with a terrible pain, as if he had not just been hit, but had definitely broken a couple of bones. From the pain, he fell to the ground again, and now he even began to think that he could see his late grandmother. Looking at how the man lay on the ground with a stupid face, the guy asked if he wanted to know what it really was. And then, without waiting for an answer, he said that this technique is called the bone-crushing palm. And the essence of it is that after 7 days from the bones of your opponent, there is only dust left. The man thought in utter shock, wondering if his bones would really turn to dust. Meanwhile, the boy asked if he was really ready to die such a death. After all, a great man said that true enlightenment is the victory over death and the creation of a new future. That's why, and the guy himself will give the man a chance and a choice. Meanwhile, in the forest, a man was moving quickly through the branches of the trees. Stopping, the girl reached out and pronounced that she was somehow bored and her father always gave her boring jobs. He said it's been rough lately and told her to stay home. But she knows the rest of the demon minions are hiding in the neighborhood. Laughing into the palm of her hand, she took out the portrait of the escaped follower and said that they would see about that. She would catch all the remaining followers of the demonic sect and bring them to her father. Then he would stop underestimating her. Then she finally unrolled the scroll, eager to see what it was that had scared her father so badly that he had decided to keep her home. There was nothing on the scroll but a portrait of some woman lying in not the most decent pose. The girl didn't say anything for a while, but the sight that opened up made her want to tear her eyes out. And in the next instant, she began tearing the scroll apart, asking loudly why this woman's portrait was so different from those of common criminals. And she wouldn't be at all surprised if all their guards were exterminated by such a remnant of followers. They'd obviously take a bite out of her. Hearing some sounds, the girl turned around in surprise and looked in the direction they were coming from. The boy asked Brother Wei if it was true that if he learned martial arts, he would stop being bullied. He replied that of course he did, and he had seen how easily he had beaten up a man who had molested the boy. And he would say even more, that if he learned martial arts, he would be admired by the whole world. The boy lay down by the tree and thought that the boy might just be hunted, especially if they knew who his master was. The boy himself paid no attention to his condition, and saying that his sister had said that if he had a master, he should bow to him. Bowed with all his might, striking his forehead on the ground. The boy finally turned his attention to him, not even knowing what to say to such a thing. After all, he hadn't expected the boy to do such a thing, and the boy himself raised his head and looked at him with sparkling eyes, saying that he wanted to become stronger, so he was asking his master to train him. Meanwhile, the man whom Ah Wei had beaten up had returned home, where he was immediately met by a large number of servants. One of the girls immediately came up to him, and holding out an envelope said that he was just in time because he had a letter from the capital. However, the man only frowned and walked past her with the words that he had no need to know what was going on in the capital. He had no time for the chatter of these old men. The girl asked in that case to let his maid help him change his clothes and apply a medicinal compress to his back. When she took off the top cape, she immediately inspected it and noticed a handprint of some kind there, which smelled of sinister energy. It made the girl startled because she didn't realize what the hell it was or where it came from on her clothes. Turning to the man, she asked in a trembling voice who did it. After all, there was even the imprint of a blow left there. Even commanders don't dare to bite a young lord, and there it was. After being silent for a while and mute to her question, the man succinctly said that he didn't need to smear the medicine on his back. Then he thought again. He had been suffering from a piercing pain in his back for many years, and even the capital's healers had only left his hands open. The only pain relief was from the compresses, and this guy, in just a couple of moves, got rid of his ailment. However, the man had no idea that the problem was not the treatment, but that in fact, no one dared to treat him harshly. He thought that guy must have done it on purpose. Like he said, he'd either join him or die in 7 days. That's why, taking his clothes, the man headed for the exit, with the words that he needed to talk to him. Meanwhile, in the mountains, even after nightfall, the guy kept on training the boy, who obediently repeated all the movements after him and did not complain about anything. The guy talked about how martial arts teaches you not only how to fight people, but how important it is to unite your inner spirit with your outer body. After a while, he wiped the sweat from his forehead and said that the two of them had done a great job. Then he sat down by the tree and told the boy to practice on his own for now, and he would think about what exercises would suit him. At that, he thought to himself, after all, he still hadn't figured out how he could start learning demonic techniques. And the man called the tech he had lying around trash. And if you think about it that way, it doesn't sound all that tempting. Besides, if he somehow starts learning demonic techniques, it's not certain that he won't be discovered quickly. And if he is, he'll be executed by the villagers. The guy didn't understand why all the villains wanted the whole world to know they were fucking villains. Can't they just pretend to be good guys and do their dark deeds behind the scenes? After all, if they did things this way, he wouldn't have to suffer now. But still, he decided that it was better to focus on the beginner's techniques for now, so that his young apprentice would understand as well. After deciding what he needed to do now, the guy turned his attention to the boy and called out to him, calling Xiao Shuai. Noticing that he was paying attention to him, he asked him to come over because the master was about to teach him the basics of fist-fighting techniques. The boy immediately ran up to him and asked if he would teach him the basics. And why was it that he suddenly called him Xiao Shuai? The boy coughed and replied that he should remember the first rule. Never introduce yourself to strangers by your real name. And for now, he was just too young to realize it. Looking at them, the girl said that she thought they were some suspicious types, but it turned out that they were just a couple of idiots. And she didn't understand why they were practicing their horse gait. It even seemed to her that this guy wasn't a martial artist at all. But that didn't matter to her either, because she was just going to keep an eye on them to make sure they didn't get caught by the wolves. Meanwhile, those two continued to read the books, trying to figure out what it said. The guy was thinking about the fact that he didn't even know what stage of cultivation the owner of this body had reached, and how he could continue to cultivate it. Suddenly, a boy caught his attention and cheerfully said that he was already done with his reading. The guy asked in surprise, wondering if he was really done yet. The boy replied that he did, and asked if he could try it. And Wei told him that of course he could, patting him on the head. The boy immediately stood and covered his eyes, then began to gather spiritual energy, preparing to make a strike and show the master what he had learned. Without thinking long, he swung around and struck toward the trees. From the force of his strike and the spiritual energy released, the tree simply pierced through, and the energy traveled further through the thicket and thickets. Punching its way and demolishing everything in its path, the energy carried towards the guy's cabin. Once it hit, it immediately detonated, causing a huge explosion and almost completely destroying him with it. After only a moment, there was virtually nothing left of the house, and it was held together literally on snot. Both the boy and Ah Wei stared in shock and horror at the destruction caused by just one blow, not believing it to be true. All this time, Ah Wei had been trying to figure out if his beginner technique had turned out to be so powerful. He just couldn't believe it. Quickly pulling himself together, he patted the boy on the head, saying that he was doing a great job. The boy replied with sparkling eyes that the master's techniques were a miracle. Wei told him to keep going, even though he wouldn't become stronger than the guy himself. But if he tried his best, he could become the second strongest. He replied that he would study hard and would not let the master down. All the while, the girl was shocked, trying to comprehend that this had just happened. Turning to the side, she looked in horror at the charred remains of the tree that had been blown away by the flow of energy. And holding her head up, she began to panic, wondering who the hell these two were and why they were so strong in the first place. Following them to the boy's house, the girl thought that her father was right. It was hard to distinguish great masters from ordinary people, and she didn't understand how she could be so blind when she saw them as just a couple of idiots. Just one blow from that boy was so devastating that it felled several trees and nearly destroyed that cabin. And that definitely meant that this boy's master had to be even more powerful and stronger. The boy, meanwhile, responded to the boy's words that he too wanted to move, saying that it was certainly possible. But his hut would be too small. At this time, Ah Wei casually touched the edge of his thumb, which he used to point behind his back to the wall, thus provoking another explosion, from which this time, the house, which was already holding on the snot, was completely destroyed. The girl watching him immediately stared at the house in horror, unable to believe that he had just destroyed his own home just because it was too small. The man who had come out of nowhere next to her cursed loudly, equally shocked at what had happened. The girl looked at him in horror, trying to figure out where he'd come from. He looked at his hand and said that it looked like he had to learn to restrain his strength. His mentee, on the contrary, liked everything, and said with sparkling eyes that his master was amazing. And Wei in turn replied thoughtfully that that was certainly true, but it looked like they would have to sleep outside tonight. The next moment, he was almost deafened by the loud shout of the approaching man who called him master. Lowering his head, the lad was surprised to see that the one who had grabbed his leg and called him, that was the same man from the inn he had beaten. The man himself looked at him with glittering eyes, thinking that it was simply unbelievable that he was a martial artist. It didn't matter who he really was. All that mattered was that he was very strong, and since the guy had destroyed the hut with a single touch, the man was very curious as to what stage he was even at. Probably the king stage, or maybe even the saint stage. So it was definitely worth following him if he wanted to get on the kill list. So he called the boy master again, and said that he was blind, and hadn't he himself said before that a man had only two choices? The boy, in turn, tried to pull him off his leg, shouting that he would never take a student of that age. The man with burning eyes said that he had chosen to follow the lad, and promised to be useful. To which the boy asked incredulously what use he was to him. The latter immediately rose and replied that he had plenty of money and could help the master with the repair of his cabin. The boy replied that there were hundreds of ways to placate a man, but that money would not get him. At the same time, he thought of the fact that the money of an ordinary servant in the inn was not much, and if he could not withstand his throw, there would be nothing to think about. However, what the guy saw the next morning instead of his house made him drop his jaw to the floor in shock. The man in front of him, meanwhile, happily asked how he liked the house, and without waiting for an answer, he explained that there was a limit to the amount of money that could be withdrawn from the bank, so he had to make do with just a modest house. The guy just couldn't believe it. What limit of money the man was talking about, and whether that was what he meant by a modest house, he didn't understand. So he asked incredulously why he had decided to work in an inn if he had no money to spare. The one explained that it was because the strength of a martial artist in their world comes first, and they say that Yuhong City is being run from the shadows, and Boss Zhao is on the assassination list. That was why he had taken a job at Zhao's inn as a servant. The man's next words about how money was useless if you didn't have strength made him feel proud. Before he came to this world, he wanted to be a weakling with a lot of money. After recovering a little, Ah Wei replied that money still had power and asked why he didn't just slip Boss Zhao some money. His words and question made the man think seriously. After all, he hadn't realized that money had power too. After a while, the man's assistant arranged with the innkeeper for her purchase and asked if what she was offering would suffice. He immediately replied that she was very generous and they would give her all the documents tomorrow. To himself, he couldn't believe that someone was willing to pay 10 times the price of that shitty hotel. That was a lot of money. So taking the papers from the girl's hands, he happily headed for the exit. remembering that he had never been the owner of the inn, so this was an even better deal. Meanwhile, the girl turned the other way, and with a smile told her host that everything was ready. The man at the same instant looked out from behind the door behind which he had been hiding all this time and watching the transaction, and then came out and took out a fan with a smile and said that the master was right after all, and money really has power. A moment later, some girl he didn't even have time to see rushed past him with great speed. Meanwhile, the guy was looking at the map, trying to figure out if this Yuhang city was really located in Yuhangzhou country. Next to it was the Gusu state, and further into the central plain. And his new teaching assassin, Matt, had actually bought out this inn, so it would be easier for them to build up their strength now. Suddenly, there was a loud and insistent knock on the door, which made the guy immediately turn in that direction and look away from his business. The girl who entered inside showed her badge and introduced herself as the guardian of Xia Yu Iron Gate. Then, without waiting for an answer, she asked if she could talk to the guy himself. After a while, they both headed to a restaurant to discuss whatever they were going to do there. However, from one waiter and manner, the guy already felt sick, and he covered his eyes in disgust, while the girl opposite him seemed to like everything on the contrary. Looking at him, she said that this is a new service there, and doesn't he like it? And Wei replied that the service is certainly good, but not everyone will like it. Taking a cup, the boy began to drink from it. He suggested that we should finally get to the main point. The girl said that she was the daughter of the head of the Iron Gate sect, and she knew who he really was. The girl said that she was the daughter of the head of the Iron Gate sect, and she knew who he really was. Meanwhile, the girl continued grimly saying that if she got it right, she knew who he was. The guy himself was frowning now, wondering if he would have to kill her to keep her from telling the others everything. However, such necessity fell away on its own when the girl said in the next instant that he was a mysterious martial artist pretending to be an ordinary mortal. The boy replied that she must be joking, and as she could see for herself, he was a mere mortal. At that, he thought that his disguise had almost been figured out again, and how he had gotten caught in the first place. Apparently this Iron Gate sect, an organization of the country's government. Looking at him, the girl was embarrassed to think that, rightly said, her father, after all, the true masters, always remain modest. Then she turned to the boy again and told him that, as he already knew, the demonic sect had been destroyed, but that some of their followers had escaped. The boy coughed and asked what that had to do with him. The girl jumped up at the same instant and said eagerly that she had one favor to ask of him. And Wei stared at her without interest, listening to her talk about how everyone was responsible for the prosperity of their world. And the Iron Gate sect was very short of people at the moment, and catching criminals was urgent. So her request was for him to help her catch all the remaining followers of the demonic sect. Out loud, the guy wondered what she meant, while to himself he wondered if she really wanted him to help her catch herself. After a while, the girl led him from the tea room to the testing room, and Wei asked if that's really where she wanted to bring him, whereupon he received the answer that it was exactly like that. The next moment, the guy was already examining the statue standing there, saying that the appearance of this place was quite unusual, and he even wondered what this examination hall was for. At the same time, he thought to himself that he was about to visit the base of his enemy. Looking at him, the girl asked in surprise, wondering if he had never passed a skill test. And then she thought that she had forgotten that a very powerful master was standing before her, and he must have never cared about such trifles. Approaching Ah Wei, she explained that a few years ago, their Iron Gate sect had started creating similar buildings and testing halls in order to test the strength of those practicing martial arts. And depending on how the test subject performs, their Iron Gate sect will give him a jade plaque, and each rank has a different color plate. Showing him her plate, the girl said that her jade plate was green in color, which meant that she was a mid-stage practitioner. Taking the plaque from her hands and taking a closer look at it, the guy asked what about the martial spirit, and what color plaque was given to a master of that level. To this question, the girl confidently replied that she did not know the answer, looking as if she had never asked herself such a question. After which, she added that to be honest, no one knew that. To date, there was still no one who had reached the martial spirit stage after all. However, it was said that to those who reached that level, a heavenly ladder would open up, leading that master to another world. Meanwhile, the guy thought that since he didn't know how strong the previous owner of this body was, it would be worth taking this test. But the whole problem was that at this moment, he was being watched by one of the enemy Iron Gate sect. Meanwhile, the girl decided not to wait any longer and grabbed his arm with words that there was nothing to think about. Then she dragged him to the door, assuring him that it would all be good for him and nothing bad would happen. At the same time, she thought that she just had to recruit this guy. And if he joined the Iron Gate sect, they wouldn't have to worry about escaped demonic sect members anymore. After a while, when the test was already over, the girl looked there in shock and asked how it was even possible, and why this balloon, completely transparent. He wasn't even white, he was just transparent, which meant he didn't even have the basics of martial arts. The guy looked at his hand in shock, trying to figure out what no martial arts basics meant, after which he thought, not realizing everything so well, it seems that the original owner of the body was able to hide his real strength even in front of this strange ball. This guy really deserved the title of the strongest in the world. With a smile, he also thought about the fact that this orb meant nothing to him. And it was enough for him to know that the owner of this body was the strongest martial artist. Looking at it, the girl wondered if something was wrong there. Ever since the foundation of the test hall, the orb had never been wrong about the true power of the practice. However, she had seen the power of this master and his apprentice with her own eyes, so it was unclear why the orb remained transparent. She didn't even notice the guy waving at her as he walked away. Suddenly it hit her. The girl remembered what it could really be. She remembered her father telling her when she was still young that learning martial arts was like gradually learning the Tao, and the great truth is that the beginning of all things is also the end. That is why the highest realization of the Tao comes only after the practitioner returns to where he or she started. Turning to where the guy was standing before, the girl shockedly wondered if this meant that this master had reached the highest Tao realization. The next moment, she finally noticed that the guy wasn't there anymore, and he had disappeared from that spot somewhere. So she immediately rushed to the door, looking around for the guy, wanting to find out where he'd gone from there after all. Suddenly, a man grew behind her back, and looking at her with a grim look, asked what it was she was doing there. After a while, a man who turned out to be her father brought her home, and after talking to her loudly yelled that it was just nonsense. Looking at his kneeling daughter, he continued to talk about how he couldn't believe that she had thought of stealing the portrait of an escaped follower of a demonic sect, and how he would even explain it to the other masters. The girl said sadly that she was just trying to help. And besides, that portrait looked very strange. Shen was asked by the plague so she could help. And for this portrait, their sect gave a lot of money to an artist who has been doing this for years. Unfolding the portrait, the man pronounced that it was still just a portrait, and what could possibly be wrong with it at all. However, just by looking at what was drawn there, the man immediately flared up, not expecting to see such a thing. But quickly pulling himself together, he coughed and put the portrait in his pocket with the words that he would confiscate it from her. Meanwhile, the girl said that although they had destroyed the demonic sect, but the founder Ah Wei himself and many other followers were still at large. If they let them gather their forces again, it will be a disaster. Her father in turn replied that it had nothing to do with her. All those who manage to escape are the strongest followers of the demonic sect, and the power of the Lord himself and the woman in the portrait is not something to be taken lightly. At this point, the demonic sect has been destroyed, so they shouldn't be in a hurry. And they need to think things through. In response to his words, the girl asked what would happen if a martial spirit stage master showed up. Wu Sheng looked at her incomprehensibly and asked what she meant. The girl once again queried what would happen if a martial spirit stage master joined their sect. Meanwhile, the man and the boy had already started their training under Wu Wei's guidance and techniques. Thoth, meanwhile, was reading scrolls that contained the way of the sword, hand-to-hand combat, heart sutra, and concealed weapons. Then, looking at the talisman in his hand, he said that it concealed a great number of high-end techniques of the demonic sect, and the former owner of this body truly deserved the title of the strongest in the world. Looking at one of the scrolls, the guy said that last time, his student had proven that even beginner techniques could be incredibly powerful, and having asked himself if it was worth trying something else, he himself replied that it was definitely worth a try. As soon as he went outside, the boy asked if he was done and what they would be practicing this time, not the same technique as last time. The guy, however, replied with a smile that this time they wouldn't be learning the same technique, but something else. Meanwhile, the girl was leading her father to the lad's cabin, assuring him to believe her this time, and saying that he would figure it out for himself when they got there. And she had personally seen a small apprentice of this master fell a dozen huge trees. Her father replied that it wasn't that he didn't believe her, it just sounded too crazy. He wondered to himself if a 6-year-old child could really fell a dozen trees with a single blow, and his master could destroy a house with a single finger. If someone had such great strength, his name would have been all over Jianghu long ago. The next moment he stopped and looked at his daughter frozen in front of him, asking what was wrong. The girl answered nothing, continuing to stare in shock in front of her, dropping her jaw to the floor. The boy standing in the clearing was practicing his next technique. Covering his eyes, he reactivated his spiritual energy and put his hands out in front of him. After a while, a whole huge Buddha statue formed behind the boy, created from spiritual energy. The sight of it made the man who was training with him's eyes pop out of his orbits. Meanwhile, the Buddha statue moved and sent the palm it held open flying. The sect leader, who was looking at all of this, immediately realized that this palm was currently flying towards them with great speed. At the same time, he noticed that his daughter was still standing and watching as a palm made of spiritual energy approached them. So he immediately jumped out and stood in front of her, yelling loudly for her to step back. As soon as she did so, the sect leader immediately began to create a defense spell that was meant to stop the strike. Looking at this picture, the girl was surprised to realize that the formation her father was using was called the 9 Bends Heart Protection. And this is the final stage of the Bronze Dome defense technique. Her father, meanwhile, thought that if he channeled all his spiritual energy into the dome, he could withstand the blow. In the next instant, the palm of his hand collided with the dome, after which, the crackling of that very dome was immediately heard. And the statue created from spiritual energy now began to fade away little by little. The boy, meanwhile, ran joyfully to the master with the words that he had succeeded after all. The man couldn't get over how excited he was. Now he wondered if they were practicing the same technique. The guy who came over told him not to despair. After all, everyone had their own talents, and maybe martial arts wasn't his forte. At that, he himself stroked the boy's head, thinking that he was indeed a promising talent. He stroked the boy's head, thinking that he was really a promising talent, a real genius in the field of martial arts, turning his back to the man who was looking at him like a miracle. The boy thought that since the boy was able to use the Tathagata's palm, maybe he could use other high-end techniques as well. The next instant, a loud sound was heard, causing everyone who hadn't seen its source initially to jump up in fright. Right in front of them, a middle-aged man who was clearly not feeling well was lying in the clearing, and his daughter was frightenedly asking how he was. Coming closer, the guy recognized in the girl his acquaintance, and calling her by name, asked who it was riding next to her. And while he wondered what they were even doing there, the man behind him thought about the fact that this man lying on the ground looked somehow familiar. The girl, meanwhile, explained that this was her father, and she had brought him to introduce him to them, but had not expected them to be practicing at this point, and he was just trying to protect her. In the next instant, the sect leader called out to the girl, who immediately responded, no longer paying attention to the frightened guy. After spitting out a mouthful of blood, he said he was fine, and his daughter asked in a panic where he was fine. Meanwhile, he apologized to the guy for coming over unannounced, and said he hoped the guy wasn't offended by them. Frowning, he thought to himself that, from what he had seen, his daughter had told the complete truth. That child standing there is incredibly strong, and even he, with all his strength, couldn't really resist his blow. But this guy was a different story. He couldn't sense a bit of ki in him. And now, he really wondered if he had reached the highest point of cultivation, and they just couldn't feel his spiritual power. Aloud, the sect leader once again turned to the boy, and said that he had no intention of interrupting them from practicing martial arts. And he, the Iron Gate sect leader, and Father Yu. Without listening to what else he was saying, the guy asked if he was the head of the Iron Gate sect. Without waiting for an answer, he thought in a panic that it was actually the main boss of the enemy forces who had come straight to him. The head said that there were many talented masters residing in the Iron Gate sect. And unlike the list of assassins, which was only a list of people whose strength was recognized by the common people, membership in the Iron Gate sect could be equated to a high position in the imperial court. While they may not be able to act as freely as the members of the list, they are still supported by the imperial court itself. Looking at the head of the sect bowing respectfully, the man thought that he couldn't believe that he had met such an amazing person. Meanwhile, the sect leader was already getting nervous. Slowly raising his eyes, he wondered why the master continued to remain silent, and whether he had said something wrong after all. But when he looked up and saw the expression on the guy's face, he was scared, trying to figure out if he was angry because he looked really angry. At this time, the guy was thinking, not paying attention to anyone around him, but at the same time, the frown didn't leave his face. Suddenly, the boy called out to him, drawing his attention, and he immediately turned around and asked what was wrong. Pointing to the head of the sect, who gave out a gasp of fear, the boy said that it seemed that this uncle had gotten sick. Finally paying attention to him, the guy tried to figure out why he himself was so agitated. After all, the sect leader doesn't know who he really is. He thought to himself that besides, He had already passed this cultivation test, and they probably wouldn't suspect a kid who didn't even have the basics of cultivation. In that case, he could take advantage of the situation and infiltrate the enemy. At this time, the sect leader, supported by his daughter, looked like he was already dying, and said that he felt like he would die before he became a true martial artist. However, as soon as the guy greeted him, calling him Master Sia and asking if he was the head of the Iron Gate sect, he seemed to come to life and eagerly said that he was the head of Sia. So he apologized once again for interrupting their training. The guy awkwardly replied that there was no need to apologize, and he was actually just doing a little exercise with his students. And he wasn't a martial arts master at all, but an ordinary person, thinking that apparently this powerful master doesn't want anyone to spread about his power. The sect head said that he apologizes because he misunderstood everything, and he wondered what his name was. The guy immediately made a respectful gesture and with a smile called him uncle and said that he could just call him Wei. Under his daughter's surprised and misunderstanding gaze, the sect leader replied with a smile that he shouldn't speak so formally, so let him just call him Brother Xia. While they were arguing about whether it would be okay for the guy to call him brother, and whether it would be rude, the girl was trying to figure out what the hell was going on in there right now. The head of the sect told the boy that he had heard about him from his daughter and had come to meet him in person. But it turned out that he had come at the wrong time and interrupted their training. The guy just waved him off, thanking him for being so appreciative, to which the sect leader said that he was only telling the truth. But he would like to ask how this boy was able to learn the movement he had recently demonstrated. The guy immediately looked at him in surprise, as if he had just now heard the question, and then asked if he was talking about the technique that almost killed him. Meanwhile, in one of the temples, a boy ran to his master, calling loudly to get his attention. Noticing that he was paying attention, the boy pointed to the side and said that he thought he had just seen something. The master patted him on the head, with the words that he had seen this something too. And that is what they saw was the true manifestation of Tathagata. Then he reminded the boy that he had long wanted to come down from the mountain and see the world. So let him call his older brother to the master. When asked if that was what the boy was thinking, the master replied that the tournament would be starting soon, and he feels that this time, things will be much more entertaining. The boy grumbled in response that his master, again, spoke in riddles that could not be understood. Meanwhile, outside Ah Wei's lodge, he and his disciples were already bidding farewell to the guests who had come to see them. Hearing the words of the sect leader that they would see each other again, the boy thought that it was not so easy to hint people to leave. After that, he thought about the technique he gave him. After all, it wasn't a full version of the technique, so if he wanted to, he could figure it out on his own. And anyway, he's the enemy and he should be careful. Suddenly, the boy took his hand and lowered his eyes sadly, which made the boy ask what was wrong. The man asked him, calling him master, if he had caused him trouble, to which the guy replied that it wasn't true and it wasn't his fault at all. It was the guy himself who hadn't checked the neighborhood. He thought to himself that the grandfather didn't seem to have any idea who he was, so there was nothing to worry about. When the boy opened the door to the house, he said that he could rest for the time being, and the boy went for a short walk. He thought to himself that Xiao Shuai's talent was unbelievable, and he had no trouble mastering the techniques, so it would be hard to keep him in the shadows. Wasting no time, the boy made his way into the house and immediately made his way to one of the rooms that was clearly meant for him. Immediately, she took off her hat and unbraided her hair, sitting down in a chair and saying that the master was very kind to her, so she should work even harder than before. Meanwhile, the guy had already reached some rocky area where there was nothing noteworthy. Looking at one of the mountains, he said that he didn't know how destructive the technique would be if he used it himself, but it was worth a try. Suddenly, a cough was heard from above, coming from the top of the cliff, causing the guy to cock his head and wonder if anyone was there. The girl hiding behind the rocks asked grimly how this was even possible. And she hadn't even had time to heal her wounds enough, and somehow they'd already found her. Filling her hand with dark energy, the girl immediately pointed it in the direction where the sound was heard from, though she didn't know where the guy was, but she could guess. Whereupon she stopped, and holding her hand thought that she couldn't just die there. She can't simply because her master is still waiting for her and she simply can't let him down. The girl's eyes began to close little by little, even though she knew she couldn't lose consciousness now. She had to gather all the spiritual energy she had left. Seeing the guy who approached her, the girl didn't pay attention to the fact that he was asking if she was okay, and thought that his smell was somehow familiar, and it was very similar to the smell of her master. In the next moment, the girl still completely blacked out before she could realize anything, immediately falling into the arms of the guy surprised by this outcome. After a while, the guy brought her to his house, and having washed the wounds of dirt, immediately bandaged them, after which he exhaled tiredly and sat down in his chair, immediately responding to the back of it. Then he picked up the cup and immediately tipped its contents into his mouth. Looking at the girl, he thought it was going to be a rough night, but he made it through. And luckily, he'd watched a whole bunch of science videos, so he already knew what to do. Looking at the way the girl, even through her sleep, was calling for her master, the guy thought that she was already in pain, but she still keeps thinking about her master. The next moment, there was a knock on the door, and a voice behind it asked if he was awake. The guy immediately walked to the door and opened it, asking what they needed and if something was wrong. The girl at the door here said a lady said she wanted to talk to him, and before she could answer the guy's question about who the girl was, the very girl she was talking about came out from behind the screen and said hello to the guy. The one in turn immediately jumped out the door and pinned her back, then awkwardly asked why the girl had shown up. She, in turn, handed him a pouch and said it was what her father had asked her to give him. He, in turn, immediately began to open the pouch with interest, asking what else was in it. He didn't pay attention to the fact that the girl had asked him not to open it right there. The next moment there was the muffled sound of an explosion, and then it was as if something was being hit. And the guy himself found himself overwhelmed by the mountains of scrolls and books that were in that pouch. Once he managed to crawl out from under the rubble, he grudgingly asked if it was a spatial bag. While the guy was looking at the scrolls and asking what they really were, the girl was diligently gathering them back into her pouch. And in response to his question, I still decided to explain what it was and where it came from. Looking at one of the scrolls the boy had given him, her father said he couldn't believe what he was seeing, and he didn't know there was such a powerful technique. Turning to the girl, he told her that she should open the treasury as soon as possible and present gifts to Mr. Wei. That was why she brought all sorts of pills, techniques, and weapons of their sect. And her father let her bring everything in his treasury so that the boy could choose his own gift. After finishing telling this, with words that she had completely forgotten about the scroll, she held it out to Wei, then explained that they have a big hotel, the biggest in Yuhang, so her father said that they must have a lot of visitors, and these are the escaped followers of a demonic sect. So if he sees anyone who looks like them, he should tell them right away. There's a reward for each follower. While the guy was looking at the painted portrait, thinking that he was lucky again, and his luck had smiled on him again, the girl told him that, for example, the girl painted there was actually a real murder weapon, which was created by the Lord himself. And once, in just one night, she had destroyed as many as 3 small sects that dared to rebel against her lord. And the girl had even heard that she was hiding in the vicinity of Yuhang, which worried their sect. Looking at the portrait, the guy realized with horror that it was, in fact, the same girl he had stumbled upon yesterday. Standing in front of him, Yu asked uncomprehendingly what had happened, and said that she didn't think she would still do such a thing. Sensing some sort of scent, the girl moved closer to him and sniffed, and then asked why it smelled like blood, and if he was hurt, or if it could be someone else. The guy couldn't answer anything, trying to figure out how she even realized he smelled like blood, and if she had a dog's nose. While he was thinking about it, the girl glanced behind him at the room, thinking about the blood stinking from there too. The guy at the time said in a panic that she couldn't go in there because it was his bedroom, to which the girl replied that since he was so excited, she was even more curious as to what was going on. So she immediately ran to his bedroom with the words that she was sure she was covered in blood right now. Looking her way, the guy tried to stop her in a panic, cursing everything around him because now she could easily see everything. But when she looked at the bed, she frowned and said that she knew it, and the guy should have told her that he was hurt. He was thinking that the girl had really gotten away. Then he told her that she had misunderstood, and that he had actually stumbled upon an injured kitten yesterday, and had decided to take it with him. After treating all the wounds, he fell asleep, and then he disappeared so suddenly. The girl said that almost no one in the city kept cats, and perhaps he had been brought by the Wangu Palace disciples. So it was a pity that he had run away, because the palace disciples would have thanked him generously. In response to the guy's question about what kind of palace Wangu was, the girl replied that a tournament would be held soon, so his students had come to Yuhang. And she forgot to warn that this year, Yuhang had been chosen as the arena, so it would be lively for a while. Not noticing the guy's condition, the girl told him not to forget about the list she gave him, because he was going to have a lot of guests soon, and a couple of them might drop by. And Wei glumly thought about the fact that it was Wangu Palace that was poisoned by the millipede venom of the previous body master. But he couldn't use his power yet because he would be exposed. So he asked the girl if he could sign up for the tournament. She said of course he could. As she left the room, she asked if he really wanted to enroll his student. The guy replied that he did, and even though he was very young, he thought it would be good for him to get some real experience. In response to the girl saying that he was a talented master, the guy smilingly replied that it was Shuai who was very talented, and he was just supporting him. He thought to himself that it would be too suspicious if a master of equal strength showed up right after Ziwei went missing, which was why he would deal with everyone from the shadows. Finished thinking about it, the guy followed Yu Yu, wondering what he would do with his escaped followers. Meanwhile, as soon as the footsteps died down, the girl on top of the bed jumped down, and taking Ah Wei's clothes, she began to sniff them, thinking that she couldn't be mistaken, and this was her master's scent. The Sword Path Tournament is a competition among swordmasters that was organized jointly by the three great sects. However, the sword soon ceased to be the main attribute of the tournament. Masters of other martial arts began to participate as well, as the winner was rewarded with magnificent artifacts, pills, etc. At the same time, the winner would not only make himself known to all of Jianhu, but would also have the opportunity to contact the three great sects and climb to the top of the world. Therefore, for many martial artists, participating and winning this tournament has become a lifelong goal. When a loud shout echoed throughout the inn, the parishioners immediately jumped up in fright and looked in the direction it was coming from. The man with the yellow hair was crying, and forgave the master to take him to the tournament too, because he really wants to participate there. Putting a hand on his shoulder, the guy told him that it wasn't a matter of not wanting to take him along at all. It's that he needs someone to back him up, and he's perfect for that role. Listening to him, the man cried again at such an honor. Really crying, the man waved to the boy, even though he had already turned away, and shouted that he would wait for him there and look after the inn. He thought it sounded strange coming out of his mouth. After a while, the streets were filled with crowds of people who had gathered there in anticipation of the opening of the tournament. One of the men was trying to push through the crowd, and looked at the man who didn't want to move and asked loudly why he was frozen and what he was looking at. However, as soon as he saw what everyone was looking at, his jaw definitely dropped as well. All the people looked at the guy and his disciple in shock, whose suits had unique characteristics and cost a fortune. Confused by these looks, the boy asked the teacher why they were all looking down at him like that. He didn't answer, thinking that this was what it was like to be in a god costume, and it was better to take the costumes off for now. Looking behind his back, the guy didn't understand. He wondered if this tournament was really prestigious, because from everything he saw, there were only old people and children there. Suddenly, someone from outside called out to him, and the guy immediately turned to him. The man who approached said that he was apparently participating in the tournament for the first time, and with the words that all these treasures wouldn't help him, he asked to give them to him out of the kindness of his heart. Putting them all away in a pouch, the guy replied that it was a gift his student had given him as a token of appreciation. From this answer, the man only got angry and asked if the man was trying to humiliate him. However, the guy was no longer paying any attention to him, turning in the other direction, where the girl who handed out tournament assignments to all the participants took place. Saying that it looked like the tournament was about to start, the guy waved goodbye and walked towards the girl. Taking one of the scrolls, he thought about the fact that this guy looked like a supporting character, so maybe he had dropped out in the first stage of the tournament. After everyone had sorted out their scrolls, the girl said that it looked like everyone had gotten their assignments, and then announced that the first round of the tournament would start in half an hour and last 12 hours, so she wished everyone good luck. Suddenly, the guy asked her to wait, but no one was listening to him anymore. Then the guy said out loud that this is a martial arts tournament, so why are they forced to pick herbs? It makes him feel like an employee who was hired for nothing. Exhaling tiredly, he said that he wouldn't have been able to find those herbs even if he had pictures. So it was a pity to have to give up participating in the tournament. After a while, they came to the forest and made a fire there, and the boy immediately went to sleep by it. Suddenly, the bushes near them stirred as if someone was there. One of the men sitting there said they'd been watching this guy for a long time. There maybe they'd finally get down to business. It didn't look like he was a mastermind after all. The second man replied that he agreed, and he was not clever, since he had come to the square in treasure with a child, so surely one blow would be enough for him. Their ringleader said that if they sold all his stuff, they'd make money like they hadn't made in 20 years on their orders. The next instant, they immediately sprang from their hiding place in the direction of the lad with a loud shout that they would capture him. At the same instant, however, nets hidden under the foliage flew towards them. Finding himself tangled and bound by the net, the ringleader asked loudly what the hell this was all about, and who dared to interfere with his plan in the first place. The guy hung all the bandits from a tree and said that, as he suspected, they're just a bunch of minor characters who don't stick around for long. At the same time, the guy kept reaching out with spider nets, feeling like a real human spider. Walking up to the ringleader, he asked if they really thought he was really a complete moron. After all, he had purposely flaunted his treasures in plain sight from the very beginning, and pretended to be a rich kid who thought he was a martial arts master. And he knew from the beginning that some idiots would definitely buy it and get their hands on his treasure. So all of this, even the fact that they would come after him and attack him, he set it up on purpose. After all this, he said that now he understands why the villains were so fond of manipulating people. Because the sensations are incredible. Getting to the point, the guy said that to be honest, he wasn't really familiar with this world and area. And also he didn't want to shine for a while, but they left him no choice. Smiling grimly as he looked at them, the guy asked if they would help him with something he just had to do. Sitting in front of one of the tournament leaders, Yu said that it was even surprising that she was the one assigned to lead the tournament. The girl replied that it can't be helped. One never knows what's on the emperor's mind. And didn't her father tell her about it? Yu hummed and replied that he hadn't told her anything, and they hadn't talked at all lately. He's been practicing and doesn't even come out of his room. Meng Changqiu said in response that Uncle Sia had never been able to break through to the Saint Warrior stage after all, although he had long since mastered the Nine Ben's heart defense technique perfectly. Yu said that she knows her father no one can change his mind, and it's definitely not something she can do. Ignoring the state of the girl in front of her, she said that she wanted to tell her that she had recently met a lurking master. The girl immediately put her hand on her shoulder and loudly asked if she was attracted to some man of unknown origin again. Did she know what sect he was from, who his teacher was, and where he came from? She replied that she shouldn't worry, because her father had already sent someone to get information about this master. Plus, this craftsman is very fond of small animals, and even took in an orphaned child. That's how generous he is. While she was talking about how beyond any doubt, this guy is a great person, the one continued to stare at the people in front of him with an evil smile. Lowering his eyes to the floor, the head-shaking hands held out to the boy the root he had asked him to find. When he took it, the guy asked if it was black ginseng, because it didn't look like what was on the picture. It looked more like what his mom used to make soup out of. The ringleader immediately thought in shock. Did his mother really cook him black ginseng soup? How rich is this guy in general, and this is such a waste. While he was thinking about how he didn't understand the quirks of the rich, the guy said they had done their thing so they could go. This further shocked the ringleader, who immediately asked in surprise if he would just let them go. The guy immediately asked what was wrong, and did he really think it was worth it for a man like him to get his hands dirty on them. Then he said to remember that every life is worth something, not politely interjects, and then to the benefactor who decided to keep their lives. Since they were colleagues, he called them over and told them that he would give them some useful advice. He made so much worthless cannon fodder that he learned to easily dispose of it once. To reach the top, martial arts skill alone is not enough. You must also have a head on your shoulders. These words shocked and frightened the leader even more, and he did not understand what he meant by his words. But quickly grabbing his minions, he immediately ran out of there with the words that he wouldn't ask any more questions, and they would just leave. The guy went to bed and woke up the next day when it was light. Noticing the boy next to him, he yawned loudly and asked him what time it was. The boy replied it was the hour of the dog, and he meant time. Taking the fruit from the boy's hands, the boy asked where it came from, and what it even was. The boy pointed us out the ginseng and said that, took it from there. When he woke up, that mountain was already there. The boy looked suspiciously in that direction, answering nothing to his words. He then said that this pile was just huge, and then suggested that he put everything in a bag first, and then pull out as much as he needed. All this time, the girl he rescued was watching them. She had collected it herself and brought this ginseng there. Meanwhile, the girl had already started checking out what the tournament participants had managed to find. The first person brought an incomprehensible thing, from which the girl immediately shouted that it was a failure, and told him to hurry up and get it out of there. After that, she started complaining and saying that she was saying that there was no point in you being there, and it would be better if they just ordered a large shipment from the merchants. And her assistant told her not to say so because this year's weather was not pleasant. So it was not surprising that the crop was badly damaged, and the great sects could not afford to go along with the unscrupulous merchants who had brazenly inflated the price of black ginseng. The girl in turn said that they just wanted to cover up the freebies with nobility, and it's disgusting. And they dared to put this dirty work on them, which is akin to a mother putting poison in her daughter's wine. Next, a guy came up to them and asked if that's where to turn in the wife beater. Then he said that their assignment was too vague, so he didn't know what was needed, of course. These words really pissed off the girl, who thought that she was drawing pictures of herbs herself, so they couldn't be blurry. The next moment, she looked at the mountain of ginseng in front of her in shock, thinking that even digging up a whole mountain wouldn't find that much. Meanwhile, the guy scratched his head awkwardly, saying she hadn't said how much was needed. And couldn't they choose which ones they wanted? This surprised the girl even more, who thought in shock that he didn't realize what he had brought. The guy didn't understand the reason for her indignation, so he asked what was wrong, and did he bring the wrong thing? The girl took one and said it was all enough, but in fact one lower quality root would be enough to complete the task. The guy's offer to take everything at once shocked them enough to think that he didn't realize they were valuable. Looking at their confusion, the guy said that they had found them there in the woods, and besides, he didn't like the taste of them anyway, so let them have them. Suddenly, the girl realized that the task of the first stage of the tournament had long been deliberately omitted rumors, and that was why everyone knew that it was the Wangu Palace that would harvest the black ginseng. So most likely this guy brought it to fix things with the palace, and now you've got it all figured out. It was worth saying that this guy is really generous. Well, that's good enough to mess around behind the Wangu Palace. She immediately said that in that case, from now on, he could address her without any formalities, and he had helped her a lot and proved his righteousness. The girl's words that the palace accepts his gifts and is ready to make good relations with him finally shocked the guy. Meanwhile, the girl extended her hand to greet him, saying that she was Saint Meng Xiangqiu, and she was very curious about the guy's name. After a while, the guy and his students were already following the girl who had called them somewhere. The man thought happily that he couldn't believe that he had been invited to the official venue of the sword tournament, and he would forever imprint this glorious moment in his heart. He clung to the boy and said that it was good that he no longer had to look after the inn, and that from now on he would consider him his resurrected father. The boy, in turn, loudly told him to let go of his hand, and if he didn't let go now, he would go back to guarding the inn. The men really got away from him, and looking around he asked if this was the official venue of the tournament, because from the looks of it you can't tell, and there are no people at all. The girl replied that it was clear that there were no people there, as this place had long since fallen under the influence of the three great sects. But she will say honestly that the first stage of the tournament is the trap, which only a few people can pass. We were sent direct invitations to the tournament, so there were already powerful sects gathered there who didn't have to waste time on the first stage. So even those who had passed the first stage didn't always make it to the second stage unless they had enough skill, or they would only be useful as a food vendor here. So it's not easy to make it to the second stage of the tournament. But since he's helped her so much, she'll get them the last 3 passes. Even though the guy didn't understand what it was he was helping her with, he still thanked her and called her very kind. She in turn said that food and lodging were provided for the tournament, so she would take them to the hotel. Lifting the boy in her arms, she pronounced that he must be tired of stomping his feet, so she would carry him. Looking at her, the guy thought that maybe this saint shouldn't be trusted at all because it seems like I can fool her too easily. As soon as they arrived, the girl looked at the guy and said she had something to give them. After which, he threw something in their direction that the guy immediately caught with both hands. After looking at what the guy got, he asked what it was. The girl answered that it was a sign of the participants, and they would be needed for registration at the hotel. And the whistle is her gift to him, so if he needs anything, he only has to whistle, and someone from the palace is sure to help him. Whereupon she said that there was only one such whistle, and she had to try hard to get it, so let him not use it as a trifle. However, the guy didn't listen to her, and immediately tried to whistle, and then said he didn't whistle. This made the girl angry, and she shouted loudly that she had already told him not to whistle at him for nothing. Upon entering the hotel, the guy immediately said that this hotel has a nice decor. After looking around, he said he could even say it looked like a 5-star hotel. The man immediately asked happily if he liked it, and then promised that when he returned he would hire workers to remodel their hotel in a similar style. Walking up to the host behind the front desk, the guy asked him to sign them in. The guy answered, of course, and asked how many there were. The guy showed the tokens and said there were 3. Suddenly a girl came up and said that if they took the baby, they seemed to have gotten something mixed up, because this is no place to play and she advises going back to where they came from. Suddenly some man asked her in return why she cared so much about other people's business. How does she even know that children can't enter the tournament? Then the same could be said for an ignorant girl like her. Ta turned angrily and asked what he'd said. Then she explained that she was just trying to give some sound advice. The same man tipped the wine bottle to himself lying and said what she heard. The girl immediately clucked and said that there was no point in talking to a donkey that couldn't tell good intentions from bad ones, and then walked with her group further inside the hotel. Meanwhile, the man turned to the guy and asked him to ignore them, because in a world where strength has always been respected, There is no distinction between a man and a woman or a child. And if they really thought some ordinary child could get in, they were very wrong. Anybody here should be considered an equal, or you'll be sorry. Well, that if there were any problems, they could safely go to him, made the guy smile a little. After which, he bowed respectfully and thanked him for his concern. All this time, the girl he saved from death was watching him. Looking at him, she thought of his mesmerizing she would recognize from 1,000. And even if he had changed his appearance, she couldn't be fooled that way. Even though the guy saw her, he could still feel her gaze on his back, which made him try to understand why he felt like someone was following him. After a while, he had already come to his room and lay on the bed looking at the whistle in his hand. He remembered how the girl had told him to let him whistle if he was in trouble, and then someone from the palace would be sure to help. The boy thought that if he used the whistle to grab someone from the palace and get information out, he would definitely become an object of suspicion. Suddenly, he heard a loud scream that made him jump up frightened on the bed and ask what was going on. And immediately, a man burst into the room with a boy in his arms, and pointing to the exit, said loudly that something unimaginable was going on in there. Some thorns from everywhere were approaching the hotel while rising from the ground. As soon as they reached some people, they killed them immediately. Some people said that the tournament had already begun, and it was a battle to the death, and they made the wrong choice. As soon as people died, the thorns would let them go and head for others. One of the masters knelt down in front of his sister and told her they were done there. Ta in turn smiled and said that in that case they were moving on to the next place, and the winners of this tournament would definitely be them. Meanwhile, for the most part, things seemed pretty calm in the city, with nothing to portend trouble. But the towers that were suddenly standing still were subjected to an explosion and immediately collapsed into small pieces. Out of the smoke and dust a moment later, several men appeared and immediately jumped onto the roof of one of the houses. The gray-haired man didn't utter that he didn't know his old acquaintances would be there. The second man pronounced that they hadn't seen them in 4 years, so let them not disappoint him. And the girl, frowning, said that she was already sick of their appearance. Then they all excitedly said that it was time to decide who was the strongest and that this battle would be the last, and immediately jumped down and then without wasting time began to fight each other. Activating the magical talismans, the man smiled and tossed it towards the girl. Ta in turn laughed and asked him if that was all he could do. Then she easily knocked away his talismans with her umbrella, activating the protection on him. He said that he was the seer, and not that he came there knowing that he would lose. Meanwhile, the old man activated his weapon and pronounced that one was using all sorts of tricks and the other was watering down all phrases. And tonight he will show these two scum the power of a true martial arts master. Saying that, he immediately activated his weapon, the energy from which spread everywhere and destroyed more houses. Looking at it, the man happily said that this was a battle between the strongest martial artists. Masters from all the big all gather in one place to showcase their skills and compete for first place. It's all so galvanizing and shaking and scary, but it's also so gorgeous at the same time. The old man said he didn't want to waste his power on her showy tricks, and the girl told him to shut up and not think about the fact that she didn't know he'd put a bounty on her head. Looking at this guy is even more surprised at what really martial artists and said that it turns out that these masters came there to solve their personal grievances. Feeling a few people behind them drop to the ground, a guy frowned and turned there. Listening to the girl tell her minions to grab their signs, the guy thought to himself that if it was you guys who were harassing them during the day. Suddenly, a man stood in front of the guy ordering him to watch his back. The girl immediately shouted to her own to be careful because he was attacking. Meanwhile, the man pulled checks out of his pockets and tossed them toward the girl. The girl immediately realized what it was, and therefore began to look at the checks that were falling down with sparkling eyes. After a while, they noticed that the people had disappeared somewhere, and the girl tisked and said that it was just a hoax. Then she started collecting checks with the words that there was no point in running after them anymore. So let them just collect this check and find another target. Suddenly she dropped dead, and the people who were with her screamed that it was an enemy attack. Looking at the girl in front of them, they began to ask who she was and what she wanted. Ta asked in response if they were trying to harm her favorite master, because she can feel that powerful aura. Meanwhile, the boy ran from there holding with both hands his master and the man who was with them. All the masters who were fighting amongst themselves immediately stopped as well after sensing this property aura. They didn't see the girl, but at the same time, they wondered if there was a Saint Warrior stage master showing up there. In the meantime, the girl had already collected 139 tokens, after which she enclosed them in a spatial ring, and then said that when she dialed 520 she would give the spatial ring to the master, and it would be the perfect chance for her to reunite with him. Meanwhile, the boy pulled both the guy and the man onto the roof and looking at the man throwing up, asked if he was okay. Tut retaliated by asking him to promise that next time he'd at least take him by the belt and not the collar, then turned to the foreman and asked him what they were going to do now. The one in turn asked what else they would do, but watched the unfolding spectacle. In response, the man looked at him questioningly, not sure what he meant, after which he caught a chicken thrown in his direction, then mentally asked himself why the master was even carrying these things around. Not listening to his words about going over there and lying down to rest, the boy said that he had told him how much he wanted to participate in the tournament. And now he refused to have fun and didn't have to worry about it because the master had taken care of everything. Then he held out a plaque and said that as he understood the point of the second stage was to collect these plaques, and the more they collected, the higher the place would be. So there's no point in chasing after the little saps and wasting their energy. They can just wait it out until they've killed each other and then take away everyone who took the most plaques from their plaques. The man immediately thought he was absolutely right, so he sat down with them and began to enjoy his meal. The guy continued to sit quietly, not suspecting that anything could happen to them. The next instant, a magic barb flew into the place where they were sitting and pierced through the roof. Then she grabbed and enveloped the boy, who didn't understand what was going on with her barbs. Meanwhile, the clan leader continued to comprehend the mysteries of the scroll the boy had given him. Suddenly, he shockingly opened his eyes, feeling the spiritual power overflowing from him. What he felt was absolutely pure spiritual energy. He immediately cried with happiness, with the words that it was simply amazing, and he would never have thought that there was a technique that would perfectly match with his 9 Ben's heart defense technique, and the treasures from his vault were worth it. However, as it seemed to him there were many flaws on this scroll. It was better to just wait for the next meeting with Brother Ah Wei and then ask him for advice. Thinking about the fact that as soon as he finished training, immediately go without muzzling the bastards that called him an old loser, the man left his room. One of the students immediately greeted him and said that since he was out, he had finished his training and was curious about how it went. The man said with a smile that everything went just fine. Then the disciple replied that he was happy for him and nothing had happened during his absence. Hearing his daughter call him, the man turned in her direction and asked her to come over because he had something to show her. With the words looked at it left energy in his hand. The girl looked around and said that it was the 9 Ben's heart defense formation, but something was wrong with it. In turn, her father told her in a cautionary tone to look more closely. The girl in turn began to turn around and turn her head in different directions, asking what to look out for. Looking at her own feet, she shouted in surprise that it was the golden lotus of the Tathagata Yu that they had beheld that day. The man immediately said that this was wrong, and although his 9 Ben's heart defense technique was considered a powerful technique, but it has one major disadvantage. This technique is designed for defense only, so he won't be able to reach his full potential on offense. For years, he had been looking for a technique that would help him perfect his formation technique, and there was no way he could find it. However, after a short walk with his daughter, he still managed to do it. When he fully mastered this technique, his 9 Ben's heart defense technique would become perfect, and then he would be able to both defend and attack. Even so, it was all thanks to Brother Wei anyway. He asked how he was doing and said that he would like to visit him in person soon. To his surprise, the girl said that the guy was out of town. The men fell to their knees and immediately asked if he had left without even saying goodbye, though they should have at least offered him horses. And why had their beautiful acquaintance lasted so short a time? The girl in turn said that she had come to their hotel a couple of days ago, and one of the maids said that he had gone somewhere with his students. He also reminded her that he wanted to sign up his students for the tournament. The tournament was about to start, so she thought he was accompanying his students to the tournament. Her father came up and asked her to mention such important things at once next time, for she knows he is very impressionable. But now he was wondering why she hadn't informed him about it right away. Because if he had known that she wanted to enroll her students in the tournament, he would have issued him an invitation to the tournament. During the first stage of the tournament, it's always a mess. If they haven't returned yet, then they were able to enter the second stage. His daughter told him that he had locked himself in his room and didn't want to listen to anyone, so she would tell him about it. But the man did not listen to her, wondering why the incredibly powerful and ambitious brother of Ah Wei was interested in this tawdry tournament. But he also thinks that it's because Brother Ah Wei is both cool and generous. He just didn't want his young disciples to become hermits before they had a chance to see the world. Looking at the way this prickle enveloped the boys, the men fearfully pronounced that this was the end. Meanwhile, the girl said she'd warned him that this place wasn't for kids like him. Getting closer to the boy, she would ask him to just give up and leave the tournament because she doesn't want to hurt the little ones. Meanwhile, the guy was examining the thorny substance enveloping her, saying it was kind of weird to the touch. Suddenly, under the girl's surprised look, the man rushed toward the boy with the words that the boy had been captured. Looking at him, the girl thought what was wrong with this guy in general. Wasn't this little guy with him, or did he just not care about him? Besides, she didn't sense the spiritual energy of a martial arts practitioner in him at all. And did a mere mortal even enter the tournament? Meanwhile, the guy remembered what the thing reminded him of. It looked a lot like the slime from the book. Meanwhile, the girl looked at them and thought that something was obviously wrong. It was a ball path tournament, and how could an ordinary mortal get there? And it's not just the mind from this guy next to him that she can't feel the spiritual energy either. So she wonders if they're using some kind of technique to hide their power. It should be, but everyone goes there to show their strength and take first place, so why the hell would they hide it? Meanwhile, the man thought that although the combat skills of the master and the boy were incredible, these were sword tournaments. Every other person there might be a king stage master, and it was wrong to be distracted by the little bastards. And this sister must be at the peak of the king stage. Looking at the boy, he thought he didn't even flinch, which was to be expected from their master. He hadn't lost control of the situation even after the boy had been grabbed, and from behind the master looked even more majestic. Looking at the material, the guy said that it was created from internal energy, saying that Xiao Shui wasn't the one who needed his help, and this was an opportunity that couldn't be missed. He reached behind his scruff. The girl was surprised by his action, not realizing if he was going to attack. Meanwhile, the guy took out the knife that Xia's brother gave him. Then he said that he would cut some material for himself, and then he would study it properly. An old man passing by said that he didn't think that a holy war stage master would show up in such a remote area, and we should somehow tell him to join their sect, and it would be a pity if he missed such an opportunity. Hearing some shouting, he raised his head and looked in that direction. The girl replied to the guy that he can't see that she's holding his student hostage, and he can show a little respect, and if he does not respect his opponent, then at least respect his comrade who is her hostage. Looking at her, the old man thought that this was apparently the girl who had gotten to the child during the day, and she had the aura of an early degree War King stage master, which wasn't bad at all. Suddenly his gaze fell on something he had seen before. The girl had the same one hostage, the baby only it was unclear where his master was. Hearing some track on the other side about it already being cut, the old man turned his head in that direction. The guy kept trying to cut the material, saying that this sword was dull and would only be good for pounding nuts. Meanwhile, the man showed him the second sword and asked him to try it because he had spent a lot of money to get it. However, the old man couldn't hear what they were saying there, and so he tried to visualize it. He heard the guy tell his apprentice not to worry because his master will save him soon. And the man said it was his fault for not keeping the boy safe, and if anything happened to him, he could use that sword to kill him as punishment. This caused the old man, who had misheard everything, to exhale fearfully. Getting no answers, the girl angrily said something, then let the guy not blame her for what happens to the boy. Suddenly she noticed someone from the side cut through the bindings that bound the boy with a quick movement. The old man took it in his hands and asked if she had lost her mind and how she could abuse a child. After all, there are probably not more than 100 masters, and she decided to select the tablets of these three. Does she only attack the weak and not enough to fight the strong? The girl asked him where he was coming from, and if he didn't see what was going on in the arena, and that someone had already collected most of the contestants' plaques, and she didn't want to lose. So she had to attack them, and where did he ever see her bullying a kid? This guy provoked her. Pointing at the guy, the old man said that he saw everything with his own eyes, and this guy can't even miss his own target. All he has is a dull old sword that's already cracked. The girl immediately activated the soul-devouring technique, finally getting angry. She wanted to stab the old man with this technique, but he immediately bounced away from her attack. In the next instant, the girl took and used this technique to twist the guy right in front of his surprised student. Then she said that since he was still hiding his power, he was just teasing, so she'd see how long he could last and she'd make him show his skills. Meanwhile, the old man said that she was strong and even knew the soul-devouring technique. The boy turned to the old man and said that his master was very strong and he could definitely handle it. Tut in turn replied that he knew that in the eyes of the child, the master would always be with me, the powerful and trustworthy man in the whole world. However, it will be hard to stop the girl once her technique is activated. She can't be broken through even by the wielder. It will suck the victim until it reaches the Dantian itself. After that, the victim will never be able to use chi again, and he fears that nothing will help his master anymore. Meanwhile, the restraints holding the guy back began to crack little by little. Both the old man and the girl who had activated the technique looked in that direction in surprise, watching him get free. The girl thought it was impossible because the pud devouring technique could only break through under two conditions. Either sacrifice a martial artist and has no internal QI. Either the internal QE of the victim is far superior to the internal ki of the owner of the technique. Meanwhile, the guy came to his senses, thinking about the fact that he hadn't thought about the fact that it was somehow so weak he thought he'd press a little harder. In the next instant, the girl spit up a mouthful of blood. And as I kept looking at the guy, I started thinking about who the hell he was. The old man thought that maybe this guy was much stronger than both of them, and then thought that it couldn't be. Suddenly appearing out of nowhere, the girl caught the guy in flight. After that, she lowered herself down onto the roof with him right in front of the rest of the people. And then she started hugging him, calling him master. Finally getting off his back, she apologized, saying his apprentice was worthless and came too late, so the master had to do everything himself. But he's strong and he was able to deal with this opponent. So she's asking to take this ring, because it has 520 entrants. Putting the ring on his finger, the girl said he had to change his appearance and enroll in this shitty tournament to get revenge on the pathetic 3 sects. And as expected of her master, he always weaves ingenious plots. Feeling rather awkward, the guy tried to ask who this girl was, after which she asked with feigned drama if he was still mad at him because he used to just call her by her name. Calling her by name, the guy asked how long she'd been following him for. The girl immediately replied that ever since he had treated her wounds, she would never have mistaken the master's scent for anyone else. The boy asked what it meant that she had brought that huge pile of ginseng. She replied that it was her way of helping the master in some way. The guy smiled and stroked her head and said she certainly helped him a lot. And now he could see why he felt that gaze on him all the time. Judging by this girl's behavior, she was very close to the previous owner of this body. But he needs to understand exactly how the old owner behaved with his subordinate, because he doesn't want to be suspected of anything. The man who came up from behind cried and said that the master had scared the hell out of him. The old man, meanwhile, replied that the one could not worry because his master was perfectly fine, and he had hidden his spiritual energy so well that even the one could not realize who that master would be able to reverse the Soul Eater's technique. Looking at them, the old man thought that that was where the aura of the Holy Warrior Stage Master was, but he didn't give it any importance. Even when his apprentice fell into the hands of the enemy, he did not show his strength, but only threatened that wench with an old sword. The boy was sure from the very beginning that his master would not let him suffer, with the thought that right in front of him now was a good sapling. The old man smiled, thinking that he just couldn't pass it by, and he should be brought into their sect, and with a grim smile looking at the people in front of him, asked the guy what his name was. Looking at his nasty face, the guy thought with disgust who this guy was, and why he looked more like a villain than the villain himself. The girl meanwhile asked if the foreman wanted her to deal with him, and the man asked in response if they knew each other. The girl said she knows him, but he's not old enough to know her yet. Unless she's confused, he's the 3rd elder of the Uden sect. The vagrants call him the god of drunkenness. The guy asked if it was one of the 3 great sects. The girl replied that it was, and in the past they had disliked the sect because they were too poor, and their disciples were vagrant, so they wouldn't even include them in the list of those they were declaring war on. The guy tried to bring up how it was that he didn't include their list, and was he really that short-sighted? The girl explained that when the other sects found out about it, they thought that the Wuding sect had colluded with their sect, and almost declared war on them themselves. If it wasn't for the fact that the Wuding sect had 3 elders with the War King stage, they wouldn't have had to do anything and would have drowned each other in blood themselves. However, when their devilish sect was in its prime, even if they joined forces and attacked them, they wouldn't come close to winning. Of course, now their sect is in a temporary decline, but he believes that as long as their head is with them, everything will be back to normal soon. Looking at them, the old man tried to understand what they were talking about. Without realizing it, he coughed and reminded himself that he had actually asked a question. Then he said he was wondering who he was and what sect he was from. Or maybe he still hadn't found a place to live. The guy replied with a smile that his name was Li Wei, and then thanked him for his help and told him that he didn't know how to address him. The old man said with a smile that his young apprentice called the old man grandfather so he could also address him. And the boy said he wouldn't dare. Looking at him, the girl almost cried. She didn't realize when the master had last talked to someone in person, and what had happened to the master while she was away. Suddenly, a guy approaching her from behind called out to her, calling her sis, after which he asked her what her name was, and if she knew his foreman. The girl in turn clucked and turned away, not wanting to get involved with the likes of him. She realized that if she'd been around the master, he wouldn't have had to deal with these scum. Suddenly, the old man turned his attention to her and asked who the girl was. He thought to himself that even though this girl didn't hide her powers, her aura was strange. The guy immediately replied that it was his cousin. He hadn't seen her in years and by chance they met at this tournament. After listening to him, the old man replied that he realized they knew each other, and as he already knows, this tournament was organized by the three great sects. It was for powerful masters from all over Jianghu to gather in one place and exchange their combat experience. However, in reality, the true goals in tournaments were to attract new talent, and to be honest, he and his disciples had taken a liking to him. So he would ask him directly if he wanted to join his sect. The guy smilingly thanked me for the invitation, but said they weren't interested. After a while, when he was already riding in a carriage with a girl who had listened to his story, she loudly asked him if he had refused the invitation of the third elder. The guy calmly replied that for some reason, he had started insisting that he and his students should join them. The girl asked if he really said no, and he said he was right and he just wasn't interested. He just explained that he doesn't want to be subject to any rules, so he will create his own sect and live as his soul desires. The girl wondered if there was some truth in his words, if she was called the Saint of the Palace. But few people would remember her real name, and this guy doesn't seem reasonable, yet he has a casual and free vibe about him. Meanwhile, the guy smiled, having come up with the perfect name to attract attention, and thought that he would take the opportunity and promote his name as much as possible. No one would suspect him of being the former lord of a demonic sect. I just had to come up with a name for my new sect, and I'd have to talk to that girl about it later. Suddenly, the man who had been carrying them loudly mouthed that they were on the spot. When they got out of the wagon, the boy immediately thanked the girl for driving them. Then he asked her if she would like to come to the inn and have some of their tea for a while. The guy didn't have time to respond when he heard fireworks start exploding around them, after which he immediately turned around towards the inn. The girl who came out immediately smilingly congratulated them on their victory and welcome back. The servants lined up immediately congratulated the master on his triumphant victory, and the girl went up to the guy and asked him where the young master was because she had something to tell him. The guy pointed a finger behind his back and said that another gentleman was in that carriage. Suddenly, the sect leader and his daughter approached and called out to the guy. Quickly approaching him, the sect leader grabbed his hand with the words that he had been away for so long. The sect leader himself was glad that he had returned. Not paying attention to his daughter's words to be quieter, he began to tell that although the results are still unknown, but he is sure that the boy took the first place, and he had been waiting for him since morning to congratulate him first. Suddenly, a trembling voice was heard from outside calling out to the sect head. The girl was just in shock. She did not understand what was going on there, and whether it was the same powerful master that Yu spoke of. Yu approached her and asked why she was there and what she was doing there. The girl replied that she was the one who should have asked what they were doing there and if they knew each other. Yu replied, of course not, saying that he was the guy she told her about. However, she shouted why she needed his name at all, and asked me to better tell you why my uncle, known for his gratitude and restraint, behaved so strangely around this guy. The sect head replied that even though she was a palace saint, she must realize that Jianghu respected the master's strength. Even the guy addressed him as an elder for the first time, so why did she continue to speak to him in such a manner? The girl reminded him of something much older than the guy, and she didn't think it was appropriate for him to call this young man his brother. He said with a smile that, as they say, a teacher is someone you can learn from. If not for brother Ah Wei's refusal, he would have called him father. And all because if it wasn't for his brother's generosity, he wouldn't have been able to break through to the next stage. He's a real deity to him. Tired of watching this, the girl asked her friend if her father was all right because she thought something was wrong with him. She said it was fine, he was just a little overexcited. In turn, that girl was not at all happy with such an answer, and so she asked if she called it a little overexcited, and then asked if the uncle really broke through to the next stage thanks to this guy. In response to Yu's question about whether she remembered the main drawback of her father's 9-Ben's heart defense, the girl said that of course she remembered it was a very powerful defense technique. However, its disadvantage is that it prevents you from attacking your opponent. And she knows that uncle has been searching for an attacking technique all this time that could be combined with his 9-Ben's heart defense technique. However, it's almost impossible. There aren't many compatible techniques in the world, let alone a powerful formation technique. Meanwhile, the sect leader asked his brother if he could see what was missing in his execution of the technique. After a while, they came to the guy's house. The girl was trying to figure out why it was like this, and how this guy could be the suspicious craftsman her friend was talking about. She'd mentioned that there was a small child with him. Yu tried to explain to her that maybe she didn't know, but her brother is only hiding his power. In fact, he is an incredibly powerful master. and if they could persuade him to join the Iron Gate sect, their sect would gain new wings. This made the girl even more surprised, thinking that it looked like this guy had bent the brains of not only her uncle, but her friend as well. This guy is already very young, how can he even be a strong master? And Uncle Master of the Holy War stage, does he really need advice from some suspicious kid he knows nothing about? At this time, the man began to activate his technique with a loud scream. This technique he called the Heart Defense of 9-Ben's 2.0. Looking at which the girl Ah was even more surprised. A huge palm appeared behind the man standing on the flower, which immediately raced down and hit the ground. The sect leader pointed at it and asked the boy what he thought. Then he said that his technique was a little weaker than his young apprentice's, but he was just beginning to master it. Looking at the guy, I noticed he was standing there frowning, and tried to figure out what he'd done wrong and why he was frowning. The wrinkled forehead, furrowed brow, and tense lips meant he was definitely angry. Well, why the guy still didn't say anything was unclear. Was it really that bad? The guy himself was panicking at the fact that he was able to master this technique even with an incomplete description. And considering he's his enemy, he's digging his own grave. But if he now acts as the exact opposite of the body's past owner, then no one will definitely ever begin to suspect him. It was all about that the owner was a powerful and cruel demon sect master. And he's just a regular guy. Plus, he'd need money to re-establish his sect, so he'd probably have to invest in some incomplete version of the technique to attract followers and sponsors. Looking at the sect head and the palm mark, the girl thought in shock that it was impossible, but that means her friend was telling the truth. After a while, the girl returned to the two, where she was told she had done a good job this time, and maybe after that, the Emperor will get off their backs. She too is afraid to imagine how many people had to empty their treasuries to gather so much black ginseng. Without raising her head, the girl said that all this mountain was brought by one man. When asked if that was the case, she said that at first she thought the man had come to establish ties with their palace. However, even after the time had passed, he didn't ask for anything more than 3 official seats in the tournament. And after the tournament was over, she took him back and found that there was clearly something wrong with this guy. Even her uncle, a master of the Holy Warrior stage, was very respectful of him. And then she found out that thanks to him, her uncle was able to perfect his 9-Ben's heart defense technique. She wanted to tell him that she could try to be friends with him too, but she was immediately interrupted. The girl across from her said she'd forgotten who she was, and people who cultivate poisonous creatures can't practice martial arts. So she thinks that those creatures inside her won't let her cultivate so easily. Besides, don't let her forget that she's a palace saint. The girl raised her head and disagreed with these words. That older sister was able to awaken her cultivation, and not only can she practice martial arts, but she also walks around and escorts written handsome men. So why can't she get close to the person who seemed special to her? The girl across from her shouted that it was just chutzpah, and then said that she may have started praising her a lot, but that doesn't mean it's okay to start crossing her. Still, her big sister is special, and she is no match for her. This time too, she decided to participate in the tournament. However, during the second stage, someone managed to wrap a soul eater technique on her, and she hasn't regained consciousness since. With the words that she was the one in charge of the arena, the girl told her to find the person who dared to infringe on the palace disciple. Then she promised that as soon as she found the bastard, she'd tell her and she'd personally skin him. The people in the marketplace were discussing what they had heard, that the winner of this year's Sword Path tournament was one of their city's masters, and that their town, though small, is full of important people. And have they heard that the master of the Iron Gate sect has arrived? He's here for inspection and hasn't left yet. Some old woman said that everything was right, and that in the last few days their town had become busier. Even her shop was bringing in more money. Suddenly, a voice came from outside, apologizing for interrupting this conversation. The monk who spoke asked if they had a place in town to stay for a while. The old woman replied that the town was full of guests now, so all the rooms in the inn were taken. But she thinks that there are still places in the new hotel. However, it had recently changed ownership and renovations were underway. The boy who was with the monk and said loudly that he wanted to taste the sweets. Tut in turn replied that the money that the master gave them for the road was not much left, so they will not save money ahead, but still gave him the money. And while the boy ran merrily off to buy himself sweets, the monk thought he really wanted to go home. He was originally sent to the tournament to show the junior world and greet the elders of the 3 great sects. But he's so tired that he's willing to sleep under a tree. Suddenly, he saw some boy come up to the old lady and say that he had brought her some fruit. and his master asked him to tell her that she could bring it all back to their hotel. The old woman replied that in that case she would do so, and asked when the hotel would open. The boy replied that it would open tomorrow. The old woman said that she would come then. Then she pointed to a monk and said that it just so happened that these monks were looking for a place to stay. In the meantime, the hotel was being renovated and everything was being changed. And the saint of the palace helped as much as she could, and looking at the sign told the workers how to hang it better. Suddenly the guy who came out apologized for bothering the saint herself for such a trifling matter. And when asked why he woke up so late, the guy said that he had been working too much lately. So now that he had some free time, he decided to sleep in. Turning to the girl, he asked why she decided to stay in town, since she said she would return to her normal life after the tournament. The girl replied that she was free to stay wherever she wanted. The girl replied that she was free to stay wherever she wanted, and turned away, thinking that she didn't often get a chance to be in the outside world, so she wasn't going back anytime soon. She then went back to the guy and asked if he had seen any suspicious people in the arena A. The guy was shocked, and asked what kind of suspicious people she was talking about. Afterward, he said that, frankly, all the participants in the arena seemed to him to be dubious types. He thought to himself that he wondered why she was suddenly asking about it. She didn't have time to get to know his student's quick personality. It was impossible because they had never even met. Well, for the girl herself, the most suspicious guy in the arena was the guy himself. So she said with a little thought that it was. And most of the arena participants were unfamiliar with each other, so it wasn't surprising that there was suspicion. She asked him if he'd met a girl there who could betray her spiritual energy in the form of red vines. She was supposed to be accompanied by a couple of handsome men, and she didn't think she'd be confused with anyone else. The guy immediately realized what she was talking about and remembered the girl he was fighting with. This shocked him even more because he thought that this girl was just an ordinary minor character who would disappear after the main scene. But he didn't give the appearance of knowing her, and asked her to tell him who the girl was to begin with. The girl explained that she was a student of the Wangu Palace. During the tournament, she was seriously injured and still hasn't woken up. And Madam was very busy with her, so she was furious about it. Later, she ordered her to find out who had done it. But all the members of the arena had already gone about their business, so he was the only one she could ask. The guy was horrified and thought, how did she get seriously injured? He didn't do anything like that. And whether the inner chi of this body is so strong that he unknowingly hurt this girl. Suddenly behind the boy came the voice of a student who said that he had returned and brought guests with him. Pointing his wand at him, the little boy said that it was him, the one who had brought the child with him to the first stage of the Sword Path tournament. Even though the guy didn't remember who these people were, he said he didn't expect to see them there. Then with the words that since they came to visit them, maybe they'd better talk inside. Looking around, the girl thought she'd never stayed in a hotel before. And they're quite lavishly decorated. So now I can see how he got so much black ginseng. This guy has absolutely no interest in great sex. On top of that, he was even able to help his uncle advance to the next stage. So why was he so obviously trying to placate or palace? The girl decided to ask the guy why he decided to change the name of the hotel, because before it was called Hotel Number 1. At this time, a monk took the floor and said that they are hermits living in isolation from the rest of the world, as it is only in the middle of a mountain of forests and lakes that they can enter a state of solitude. But even they sometimes have to leave these places and face the turbulent waves of worldly life. And at such times, all they want is peace. He thought to himself that an inn was a place where people came to rest. And despite being in a hectic world ruled by powerful wizards, each traveler hopes to find their own corner of peace and tranquility. A peaceful inn just about epitomizes the ideal of every point in their world. And the owner of the inn, as he realized such a meaning in his name. So the monk said it was a beautiful name, thinking about the fact that he had been looking for this place for so long. The guy asked with tears in his eyes if he thought so too. Taking him by the shoulders, he thought that he never thought anyone could understand the humor inherent in the name. Last night at his house, the guy had a chat with a student of the body's past owner. He said she may have already heard about it, but right now he can't use his powers because of the poison he was poisoned with during the last battle. However, right now, he still managed to establish a good relationship with the Iron Gate sect, and even met the Palace Saint. Therefore, they could now take their time with the revival of the demonic sect. Suddenly the guy said that she didn't have to worry because there was no one there but them. And then he said that's why he wanted to talk to her about something. The girl immediately wondered what he wanted to talk to her about. However, the guy merely calmly asked how she liked the name of the peaceful inn. This surprised the girl, who had not expected him to ask her something like that. And now at last, someone finally realized what meaning he had put into that name. And so he looked on with shining eyes, but also at the monk who was looking at him. Meanwhile, the girl wondered if there was some hidden meaning in the new name, but she didn't understand anything. And the guy thought a movie said that the harder you hide from someone, the easier they find you. No one thinks a demonic cult overlord's gonna open up a peaceful inn in front of everyone. Meanwhile, the monk asked him if he could let them stay at his inn. The boy replied that he should not be called the host, but simply the owner, and then turned to the apprentice and asked him to lead the guests to their room. The latter complied. When the boy came to the room, he said it had beautiful new furniture, and his older brother didn't answer anything, and instead immediately lay down on the bed, happily thinking about the fact that he was finally lying on a soft crib. The boy immediately shook him and told him that he should not sleep now. The boy immediately shook him and said that it was wrong to sleep now. The boy said that's not what he meant to say at all, because their master said it was in Yuhan where they'd have the best luck. But if they don't go to the city, how will they meet their fate? The monk said that he hadn't thought about his fate when he was wandering around, but as soon as they settled in the inn, he suddenly remembered something. They had not left the city yet, so there was still a chance. The boy immediately started shaking him with words that fate is not so merciful and might disappear if they delay. So let him get up because they needed to go for a walk. Suddenly someone knocked and the boy immediately turned to go there. The monk also rose from his seat and looking at his brother asked who was there. The boy replied that it was the servants, and they had brought them a basket of fruit, and said it was a gift in honor of the opening of the hotel. The monk lay back on his pillow again, telling him to remember to thank them and could eat first, just let him sleep. Then he closed his eyes, thinking about the fact that the master had said that they should visit the city. But he did not specify what great fortune awaited them there. So I should get a good night's sleep first, because I think better with a fresh head. Suddenly, the voice of the boy called loudly to his older brother again. The one stood up and asked what else he needed, not minding the boy shivering. Showing him what was in the basket, the boy said fearfully that it was exactly what they were looking for. What he saw made the monk's eyes pop out of his orbit. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. Come closer, he looked at the fruit and thought that, apparently, this is great luck. Meanwhile, at the entrance to the hotel, people were talking about how after the renovation, his hotel looks like a palace. An old lady said she thought there was no other hotel like it in the entire Central Plain. Showing him the flowers, she said that her young apprentice had asked her to bring some flowers to decorate the entrance of the inn, and asked how he liked the flowers. The guy said thank you very much, but he didn't say no, even though he said it reminded him of something. The old woman immediately patted him on the shoulder and said that tomorrow she would come to see the opening, and she would support him properly. It hurt her to see him being bullied, but now, he was a big boss, and she still couldn't get used to it. Now being the innkeeper, he can not only take care of himself, but also that baby. It wasn't even with surprise that I asked which kid, and if she was talking about his student. The old lady replied that they would talk about it next time, because she had a lot of work to do. The guy agreed and asked her to remember to bring her friends tomorrow. Meanwhile, the guy handed her a basket of fruit, asking her to take it with her because they grew it in their garden. Suddenly, a loud voice was heard asking him to wait. Thinking that these were holy fruits that had been stolen 2 years ago, the monk ran towards it as he had never run before. He thought that if this was the fate that awaited them, why did the holy fruits end up in such a place? Quickly slowing down, he folded his arms and asked for his forgiveness, and then opened the fruit basket the guy was holding, and asked him to tell where he got these fruits from. The one scratched his face and said with surprise that if the one about the sugar apple, they grew them themselves. This answer the monk did not expect in any way, and because of that, and even more shocked, looked at him. Looking at his reaction, the boy suggested he go and see for himself. As soon as they reached the monk's garden, he was even more surprised, and now he didn't understand anything. What he saw around him were indeed planted holy fruits, but that wasn't as surprising as how many of them there actually were. The guy cut one off and said his student had picked the fruit. He liked them, so he decided to plant a couple. Noticing that there was nothing answering, the guy turned towards that monk. When he noticed that the guy was crying, he asked himself why he was crying all of a sudden. Meanwhile, the monk said that his master had made it clear to them that the holy fruits were very valuable. He thought to himself that the holy fruit tree of their temple was balder than his head, and it hadn't borne fruit in over 10 years. But 2 years ago, they managed to grow a few fruits by some miracle. However, they were stolen before they were even ripe. The monk himself never thought he'd see such a picture in this life. They have a noble air about them. It was as if he stared at them for long enough, he might go blind. Meanwhile, the guy came over to him and handed him a fetus, telling him to stop crying, and then said he could take a couple with him. It'd help promote the inn. The monk, meanwhile, said that he was wondering why their holy fruit trees were growing so fruitfully and well. Because there is one such tree in their temple, but it is not even close to the boy's tree. He asked where their temple was located and what the climate was like there. He said that their temple was located on the top of Mount Lin, and thanks to their formation, it was always a spring climate. The guy said that's the problem. After all, sugar apples are a tropical fruit, and it won't grow normally under these conditions. He thought to himself that he had made a lot of effort to reproduce a tropical climate in the garden, and then instructively told me that trees won't grow faster just because they want to. First, you have to prepare the conditions that are perfect for the tree they want to grow. Monk wondered what he was even talking about, and whether every plant had certain environmental conditions that would suit her. Looking at his hands, the monk thought that they had always thought they would forget the tree of holy fruit in the best way possible, and it turned out that they were not giving it what it needed. Suddenly, at this point, enlightenment came to him as to how things should really be done. Meanwhile, people outside the hotel, obviously visiting guests, were grudgingly asking why this hotel that looks nice is still closed. The girls said that since it's a hotel, it should be open all the time. And why did they keep her brother and her waiting so long? Suddenly, a man appeared in front of them and asked if they wanted to stay at their hotel, and then apologized and said it wouldn't open until tomorrow. The girl stopped that finally the owner showed up. She had already thought that the hotel was owned by a dead man. Then she asked why they had to wait so long, and if he knew who they were. The man listened calmly as she called him a mere owner of a bad hotel and asked who he thought he was. He immediately said he was number 27 on the kill list. He thought to himself that he wasn't what he used to be. He looked at them and asked loudly if they were getting into a fight. And why didn't she ask who he was to begin with? And how dare he call his masters in bad? The girl snatched up her sword and with a loud shout she headed towards the guy with the words that she was about to show him. However, her brother immediately stopped her and told her she didn't need to be so rude. Afterwards, he politely greeted the man and said that he was the first disciple of the Linjiang sect. It turns out that the other hotels in town are all full. Since they were going to open tomorrow anyway, maybe they could make an exception and let them in early. The man said it was more to his liking, and that they had misunderstood, and that the owner of the hotel was his master, and his sister has already expressed her displeasure with their hotel. So he thinks their shitty hotel isn't really suitable for dignitaries. The girl snatched up her sword again and shouted that he was provoking her himself. Her brother again told her to calm down, and then turned to the man and said that his sister was tired from the road, so she said something rash. And she didn't really think so, and then asked if he could escort him to the owner because he wanted to talk to him personally. The man replied that his master was talking to his guests, and he would not dare to bother him about such trifles. And he had said more than once that the hotel would not open until tomorrow, or that they, the high-ranking gentlemen, were not subject to the law. The guy was really pissed off, he thought, because he didn't even raise an eyebrow when he heard his name. Now he wondered who owned the hotel. The girl yelled out to her older brother that this guy doesn't put them in anything at all, and then snatched the sword from its sheath, promising that she would personally teach him a lesson. This time the guy didn't stop her, just calmly stepped back, watching her run towards the man. Noticing this just feigning menace, the girl stopped and was surprised that her brother wouldn't stop her. With thoughts that he now wanted to know who was behind this the boy asked her not to behave so intemperately. After that, a loud explosion broke up, which drew the attention of all the people in the city. Sitting with her father, Yu asked in surprise what happened there. The palace saint ran to the window and said that she thought the sound came from the other side. The sect leader was startled and thought it was the sound from the direction of brother Ah Wei's inn. The guy continued to calmly tell me how to actually grow sugar apples properly, in what climate and conditions it is best to do so. A sudden explosion made him turn his head in that direction in surprise. He didn't think the explosion was coming from outside his hotel, however, and said the city was pretty lively today. He thought to himself that it had been a long time since he had come to this world, and he was sure that in the near future his peaceful inn would become the most famous place in the whole world. Suddenly, a panting girl ran in and immediately called out to him. Then she said fearfully that something had happened outside his hotel. Meanwhile, the dust and dirt raised by the explosion had already begun to settle outside the hotel. The boy grabbed his sister and fearfully asked how she was. Then he looked in the direction where the man was standing, thinking to himself that even though she had a bad temper, she was the most skillful among the students of her age, and that man so calmly and easily brushed off that attack, so quite a strong guy. Suddenly he shocked, opened his eyes. There was someone else standing there besides the man. To his surprise, it was to me someone strong or adult, but just a child. At this time, the girl clenched her teeth tightly and stood up and looked towards the boy, and then shouted that she didn't know where the brat came from, but she's sure he fended off her attack and it was some treasure he's carrying. And saying it wouldn't work a second time, she attacked the boy again. However, her older brother stopped her again and asked her to provide it to him. Then he pulled out his sword and said that since they were both martial artists, you'd know who was stronger. Only this man would let them stay at the inn if he defeated this boy. He thought to himself that it meant that this boy had blocked the younger one's attack. However, at this moment, he didn't feel the fluctuation of spiritual power. He really thinks his sister is right, and this boy was protected by some treasure he was carrying. But he is the first disciple of the Lingjiang set, and just has to slay these upstarts to save the face of his sect. And if he doesn't, he'll be the laughingstock of the world. And the two of them will pay for daring to insult their sect. So the guy immediately rushed towards the guy with his sword, asking how he would actually block it. The boy didn't answer anything and prepared to attack the guy back. The blow came right on the face of the guy who didn't even have time to do anything to the boy. From the force of that blow, he recoiled far away from that place, whereupon he fell beside his sister, who screamed in horror at it, and then loudly asking how dare they hit her older brother. Threw herself at the boy with a sword, promising to make him pay for it. She was thinking that this kid only knew how to swing his fists. But since ancient times it was known that whoever was strong in attack was weak in defense. Quickly approaching the boy, she immediately jumped up and turned towards him. Thinking that since she had her back to him she couldn't do anything, she swung her sword at him and prepared to pierce through his body. After a while, the sect leader and the others finally got there. But what they saw made them stop, and shocked to think what the hell happened there. Turning to the side, the man stared at the girl who whispered that it was simply impossible. She couldn't understand how many techniques this boy knew. After all, her master had said that martial artists could only learn one technique in a lifetime. The guy who approached asked the sect leader if the problem had already been solved, and then asked his students if anyone could tell him what happened there. A man immediately ran towards him, taking the boy in his arms with the words that he could only see him in full health now because of the younger student. Meanwhile, the sect disciple, pretending to be dead, looked at the guy and thought that this young man was his master. Meanwhile, the men were telling their master that a girl came up to the inn and started yelling. He tried to calm her down, but she almost stabbed him in the head with a sword. The disciple of that sect thought that since that young man was the master of such a small devil, he might be even scarier. So we should run away as soon as possible while they were distracted by the conversation. A sudden shout sounded, causing all the people to look in surprise in the direction it came from. In response to his sister calling out to him, the guy yelled for her to wait here, and he would bring someone to help. As he quickly disappeared, the girl said that he could have taken her with him, instead of leaving her there. She asked loudly why he had run away alone. Looking in the same direction, the guy said that he got away pretty quickly. The girl asked him why he didn't stop him here, and if he was afraid that he would come back with help. The girl asked him why he didn't stop him, and if he was afraid that he would come back with help. The guy easily answered why that would be. It was just a passerby, and he had already run away. He thought to himself that trouble only speaks to those who think about it. That's why all the main characters in books always suffer so much. Turning toward the girl, the guy said that in addition they had a hostage in their hands. The girl herself was frightened, wondering if he really didn't know who her older brother was. Meanwhile, the man happily said that, telling them that his master could kill a war king stage master with one move. And they didn't give a damn about their sect, because their master will kill anyone who tries to harm them. The palace saint said with disbelief that he was exaggerating too much, saying that here could kill a war king with a single move. However, Yu said that it was not an exaggeration, and she saw it with her own eyes. The guy smashed a whole house with one finger, just because there wasn't enough room. However, the sect leader said that if they were really disciples of that sect, they were in big trouble. Meanwhile, a meeting was going on in the Linjiang sect. But even so, one of the subordinates ran inside and called out loudly for the head. In response, the head immediately tossed it aside with magic power, and then reminded him that I had already told him that no one was allowed to distract him when he was conferring with the sect heads. Tower Master said that it was immediately obvious that the head had advanced to the Holy Warrior stage, because his aura has become even more formidable. But don't be angry with this fool, because he probably wanted to deliver the important news quickly. The second Tower Master said that they were in no hurry, so they could be distracted. Then the head turned to his subordinate and told him to report what happened there. Holding his stomach, the boy said that the brother of the chapter had returned. The girl beside the head immediately asked if he was talking about Lu Renjia. If he remembered correctly, he was Lu's favorite disciple. He replied that he had left the mountain some time ago to gain experience and accomplishments. Since he had returned, he'd achieved what he wanted. He then told his subordinate to call him here and let him greet the esteemed sect heads. The subordinate said he was afraid his brother wouldn't be able to come up now. Then the head got angry and asked if he had to bring him himself. In turn, another head told him not to be so angry because maybe he had prepared some kind of surprise for him, and his son likes to do the same. And then he said that since he couldn't come to him, they'd come to him. The picture they saw when they arrived did not please them at all. The apprentice tearfully rushed to the master being beaten and unable to stand on his feet. The girl asked the head when his student had changed so much. They hadn't seen each other for a couple of months and what had happened to him. In turn, the master immediately ran up to him and asked him what had happened to him and where his youngest was. The guy said that he and the younger one had reached Yuhang and started looking for an inn to spend the night. The guy himself politely talked to an employee about one inn, but the rascal suddenly attacked him and almost killed him, and he escaped when they let their guard down. Well, the little one didn't get away. Meanwhile, outside the hotel, the boy was thanking the head of the sect, because if he hadn't brought helpers, they wouldn't have had time to clean up the place. He thought to himself that at least he didn't think the brooms were inappropriate. The head said he wasn't grateful and was ashamed that it was all he could do to help. He thought to himself that his brother liked brooms and that he should send him a couple if he got the chance. Then he said that although the Iron Gate sect is one of the most powerful sects, but even they can't open it to your interfering in other sects' struggles. Although the Lingjiang sect doesn't have many followers, they shouldn't be underestimated. And then asked the guy if he knew why the three great sects teamed up with the Emperor's Palace and established the Sword Path tournament. The guy asked if it was to look for capable people. The head replied that it was just like that, and they were strengthening their power. In his time, the demon sect lord had beaten countless martial artists and destroyed many sects. Then some sects began to unite, others simply disappeared, and others began to absorb more or less small sects. The guy asked how it was to absorb small sects. The head replied that in their world, only strength was respected, so it was inevitable. And the Lingjiang sect was one of those sects that had built up its power through absorption. The next day, people in town started discussing what had happened there, but mostly everyone was minding their own business. Looking at the inn, the girl asked if this was the peaceful inn. The head said it was a very miserable place, and apparently they had brought such a crowd there for nothing. In turn, the girl smiled and said that in her head you shouldn't judge a book by its cover. In their sect, after all, they don't use such wreaths for decoration. They use them only as a tribute to the dead. And maybe they knew they'd show up and put them there on purpose. Well, friends, I don't know about you, but I enjoyed this manhwa. The plot itself is quite interesting and intriguing. So if you liked the video, then subscribe to the channel and write a comment on what exactly you liked. And for a new part of this work, let's collect 1,000 likes under this video. All the best. See you soon.